8 City Councilor and the Chair of the Boston City Council's Committee on Boston's COVID-19 Recovery. This public hearing is being recorded. It's being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. We will be taking public testimony at the end of this hearing. If you're interested in testifying with us here in the chamber, please sign up on the sheet near the door. If you're interested in testifying virtually, please email ccc.covid19@boston.gov for the link. So that's ccc.covid19@boston.gov. And again, if you are here to testify in person and you have any written testimony, you can bring it to the side and the staff will get it. If you're watching at home and you don't want to speak on Zoom but you want to submit written testimony, you can send it to that same email, ccc.covid19@boston.gov. Now I'm going to read some long dockets. Today's hearing is on docket 0503, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend the amount of $349,500,000 in the form of a grant awarded by the United States Department of Treasury to be administered by the City of Boston's Chief Financial Officer, Collector Treasurer, from the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, CSLFRF, in the Treasury of the United States, established by Section 9901 of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, ARPA. And pursuant to the requirements of the ARPA, the grant payment would fund COVID-19 response and recovery efforts and accelerate a Green New Deal for Boston through once-in-a-generation transformative investments that address the systemic health and economic challenges in the areas of affordable housing, economic opportunity and inclusion, behavioral health, climate and mobility, arts and culture, and early childhood. Docket 0504, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend the amount of $40 million in the form of a grant awarded by the United States Department of the Treasury to be administered by the City of Boston's Chief Financial Officer, Collector Treasurer, from the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund in the Treasury of the United States, established by Section 9901 of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, and pursuant to the requirements of the ARPA, the grant payment would fund provision of government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue of such state, territory, or tribal government due to the COVID-19 public health emergency relative to revenues collected in the most recent full fiscal year of the state, territory, or tribal government prior to the emergency. And docket 0436, order for a hearing on the state of Boston's non-governmental, nonprofit social sector and charting a post-pandemic recovery. And I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Council President Ed Flynn of District 2, Councilor Liz Braden, who is also District 9 and the sponsor of the last docket, Councilor Frank Baker, District 3, Councilor Aaron Murphy at large, Councilor Michael Flaherty at large, and Councilor Tanya Fernandez-Anderson, District 7. Before I turn to the administration, I just want to explain a little bit about the hearing today. So the administration has filed a almost $350 million, $349.5 million appropriation order for kind of the remaining unallocated funds that were given for us for sort of local government expenditure by the federal government as part of the American Rescue Plan. This is our first hearing on the administration's proposal, and so our goal today is to hear from them about it and understand it and make sure that councilors have clarity on that, because it was originally introduced at the same time as the budget, and so while the two are intertwined in many of their purposes, it is a separate appropriation, and we want to make sure that everybody's kind of clear on what buckets the administration's proposing and kind of some of the more detail on that. We will be having further hearings on this docket that will focus on the different buckets specifically. So for example, it's been widely covered in the press that the lion's share of the money in this appropriation is proposed to go to affordable housing. Our next hearing in this committee will be a dedicated hearing just on the housing proposals, and at that juncture, we will also be noticing dockets from councilors related to housing. Similarly, we will do the same on climate, we'll do the same on public health. So the administration has put forward a proposal for basically all of the monies. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that councilors would like to see happen with the monies that may be distinct or may fit underneath some of those categories, et cetera. And just, I want everyone to understand that we're going to be discussing that in a series of hearings. But we do need to kind of get their initial proposal out on the table today, and that's our objective. We're also looking from their introductory presentation to give folks a better sense of what the constraints are on this money, what the sort of like program compliance aspects of it are. We also noticed the $40 million appropriation from the same fund which is proposed to support the FY23 budget. So this is revenue replacement, which basically fills in for fees and other revenues that have not returned to the city of Boston when we compare to pre-pandemic levels. And then the last docket filed by Councilor Braden is about the role of our nonprofit sector in the recovery and kind of in what way this rescue plan funds can interact with that nonprofit sector and supporting it and partnering with it. And like I said, well, we're going to have these other hearings on particular topics, and we're going to notice councilors' dockets with the docket at those junctures. Because Councilor Braden's was sort of an overall question about how we're integrating the nonprofit sector and what the nonprofit sector's recovery is looking like, we decided to put it here as part of the overview hearing so we can talk about that. So we do have a number of leaders from the nonprofit sector who are here to be on our second panel. So just so folks know what we'll be doing, we'll be hearing from the administration, we'll do councilor questions to the administration, and then we will go to the second nonprofit panel, and I'll have Councilor Braden speak to that a little bit further when we get to that panel, and then we'll do questions there as well. And again, if you're here today and you're not on either panel but you want to testify, please sign up. Depending on exactly where we are timing-wise, I may try to take one or two people from public testimony after the administration panel before we go to the nonprofit panel, but we may just have to see how timing runs. So that's the idea, and just again, to clarify for everyone, this is a big appropriation, $350 million. We are not having this hearing today and expecting to propose a vote on it tomorrow at the council meeting. This is very much like the first in a series of processes. I also see that we've been joined by Councilors Brian Worrell of District 4 and Councilor Julia Mejia at large. And I'm gonna forbear with opening statements, but I think our best bet would be actually to jump into the administration panel and then go to councilors for questions. But actually, before I do that, why don't I let Councilor Braden, if you want to say a word, because you've got the docket co-sponsored, feel free.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes. Let's see where we are.
Or I
Yes.
can come to you before the nonprofit.
Yeah, come to me before.
Okay, we'll do it before the
because I was
nonprofit
going to
panel.
introduce the folks in the panel.
All right, that seems better. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, then without further ado, we're joined today by Casey Brock-Wilson, Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Office of the Mayor, Jim Williamson, Budget Director for the Office of Budget Management, and Mariangeli Solis-Cervera, Chief of Equity and Inclusion. So thank you to them for being here. And everybody has in your emails the PDF of the presentation that they'll be delivering. It'll also be up on the screens. And I'll turn it over to you all.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Casey Brock-Wilson. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the City of Boston, and thank you to the Chair for calling this hearing today. We look forward to working with the Council over the next few months to put our American Rescue Funds to work on behalf of Boston residents. I also look forward to hearing from our panel of nonprofit experts later on in the hearing, and also from members of the public who are here today to testify. All right. So you guys have seen this slide before, but I think it's important to step back and talk about the overall federal recovery funds in general, which are outlined on this slide here in front of you. Today, we are going to dive deeper on one portion of the American Rescue Plan, specifically the state and local fiscal recovery funds, also known as CSLFRF. These direct funds that went to every city around the country are to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and its negative economic impacts. It is also the single largest rescue of and transformational investment in local governments in recent history. This truly is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to put a down payment on Boston's future and accelerate a Green New Deal. So based on the federal legislation, which is kind of outlined on the slide in front of you, there are 6 main categories of eligible ARPA spending, from a continued public health response to equity-focused services, assistance to small businesses, families, and impacted industries. In total, Boston will receive $558.7 million in SLFRF funding from the American Rescue Plan. To date, $49.5 million has been appropriated by council, and another $60 million is in reserve for revenue replacement. The appropriations by council and through the emergency relief package that was passed last year is indicated in orange on the slide, and then the revenue replacement is indicated in green. That leaves $349.5 million that has not been appropriated by City Council, and we'll focus much of our time here today on those proposed investments. So first, I do want to take a brief moment, though, and review the $149.5 that Council has appropriated for kind of community-based projects from the American Rescue Plan. $55 million was used for FY22 revenue replacement to ensure that we could maintain city services and retain staff. And then the Housing, Economic Opportunity and Inclusion, the Health Commission, and Transportation were the largest department recipients of ARPA funds, collectively receiving around 50% of the funds. And on the right, you'll see some of the recent programs that were launched or expanded with ARPA funds to date. It's also worth saying that our rapid response to Omicron from the new testing sites, vaccination sites, to community outreach would not have been possible without the ARPA resources that were allocated by the council last year. Some highlights from, it was hard to kind of pick because there's been a bunch of incredible work by our department leaders and external partners with these resources. But I wanted to highlight today the expansion of the All-Inclusive Boston program, the Fare-Free Bus pilot extension, the food safety net, destigmatization and outreach grants, and ensuring language access for all ARPA-funded programs. There's so many more I wish we had time and space to talk about today, but I'm sure departments are happy to speak to them further in the upcoming hearings. In addition, we as an administration are committed to sharing updated information about our ARPA spending with the public and other interested parties through our digital channels. So on boston.gov/recover, you can find information on the current funding opportunities, new programs, as well as information on the mayor's plan that we're discussing today in 12 languages. On Friday, we submitted another quarterly report to the U.S. Treasury. The cover page for that report is on the right-hand side of the slide, and you can also find that online. So we're trying to make sure that everything that we're reporting to the federal government, we're also reporting out to Boston residents. And on Saturday, we updated the spending dashboard on the left. So you can click in and track spending by project on a quarterly basis. You can also now click on the history button on the left to see how our spending changes over time. As a reminder, every dollar needs to be spent by the end of 2026. Okay. In fall of 2021, we also launched an ARPA listening tour that included 15 community meetings and an online survey in 12 languages across a variety of different issue areas. In total, we were able to hear from over 880 community members, and we were also informed by the budget listening sessions this winter in partnership with City Council. We thought back to the lessons learned from the listening campaign in the fall, housing stability and home ownership were the clear top priority for nearly 40% of respondents, and the second priority for another 20%. Other high priority issues included resilience to climate change, small business support, food insecurity, and many others that you see on the slide in front of you. You can read more about the public process on our website in a 35-page report that was published this winter as well. I won't spend too much time on it today. And today is just the beginning of a continuation of this public conversation about ARPA funds, and we look forward to a series of public hearings in partnership with the City Council over the next month or so. All right, I can get it to go to the next slide. There we go. I'm going to pass it to Jim Williamson to talk about FY23 revenue replacement.
Thank you, Casey. So my name is Jim Williamson. I'm the budget director here at the City of Boston, and what I'm going to be covering is the Docket 0504 part of the presentation, which is revenue replacement to support the FY23 operating budget. So As you can see from this chart displayed here, the local revenue was dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, falling $190 million, or nearly a third, between FY19 and FY21. In FY23, the city will dedicate $40 million in the American Rescue Plan Act funding to replace lost revenue down from the $55 million that was used to balance the FY22 budget. In FY23, local revenue is projected to grow by $60.6 million, or about 15%, as the economy gradually rebounds. Nevertheless, even with the critical addition of Arpa funding, the gap between the FY23 and pre-pandemic levels of local revenue will still be over $100 million. And just please note that in reserve, as Casey was talking about the overall pie, there is just under $20 million that remains in reserve for FY24. Move to the next slide. So this is, a snapshot of other cities around the country and how they've used their ARPA dollars, their state and local fiscal recovery funds. And as you can see, when you look at other comparable cities, we expect to use fewer funds for revenue replacement than others, partly because through strong fiscal management practices implemented during the third quarter of FY20 into FY21, and also given the city's sort of primary revenue source, that it being fairly resilient to shorter term market disruptions. So as you can see, some cities have to use basically all of their American Rescue Plan just to fill holes in their revenue lost to the pandemic to keep operations more or less status quo, probably with recovery efforts included as well. So with that.
Thanks, Jim. All right. So I also wanted to talk about today kind of the framework for transformational investments that this administration thought about as we put together a plan for the $349.5 million. And that framework includes a series of key values that I think is worth spending time on today. First is, of course, Arpa eligibility. As someone who works in administration and finance, we want to make sure we're in compliance with the federal legislation. So does it meet the federal criteria established in the legislation and follow-up rulemaking? Two, does it tackle a big, urgent challenge? Does it tackle a systemic challenge that Boston has been facing for a long time and put significant resources towards it to hopefully make a dent in that challenge? Third, the fiscal sustainability. How do we ensure strong financial sustainability of the city budget in the long term beyond 2026? Fourth, a transformational solution, changing the way we work or piloting a new way of providing needed services and supports to Boston residents. Fifth is a lasting legacy. Are we building something that's enduring, that will last beyond ARPA, whether it is a physical thing or also a new policy or practice that will change the way that the city works? Racial equity. How do we proactively invest in historically excluded communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19? A healthy recovery. How do we continue to an equitable response to the COVID-19 pandemic, recognizing that we are still in this? How do we create good jobs with career pathways and growing industries? And last but not least, climate justice. How do we promote climate action, environmental justice through healthy, connected communities? And I'm going to turn it over to the Chief of Equity and Inclusion to talk a little bit more about how we're thinking about equity in the context of this legislation.
Buenas tardes. Thank you everyone for having us here today. My name is Maria Angeli Solis Cervera, and I just want to, before we begin, I also am fairly new to this process, and so you'll see me type so that I can keep up with all the terminology that I'm also getting to know right now. So I wanted just to give a little bit of insight first into while the administration is currently building our working definition of the word equity, because one thing that I recognize as the Chief of Equity is that we're working from different definitions at the moment. We are also working with a definition that was provided to us by the U.S. Treasury and the federal government, which has helped the administration build the criteria to recommend the projects that are in front of you now. So first, the administration took a look at some of the impact of public health and, some of the public health and economic impact that the pandemic has had in our communities, and also identify potential programs, projects, services that can address those specific impacts that the pandemic has had on us. Move on to the next one. This is very small, so I'm going to walk us through left, middle, and right. We'll make sure that you have the necessary links to look through this as well. On the left-hand side, we are seeing the approved definitions of what we are saying impacted versus disproportionately impacted households, neighborhoods, and businesses are. For example, a household under 65% AMI, area medium income, is automatically impacted, but we are defining a household under 40% AMI as disproportionately impacted. Then if you move to the middle, the map, that is showing the qualified census tract data that tells us where in our city we can identify folks that we can identify households that fall under the 60% AMI data that I was referring to just now. Then on the right-hand side, based on the mayor's proposal and the Arpa legislation, we are proposing that 89% of the $349.5 million must be spent in impacted or disproportionately impacted neighborhoods, households, or businesses as defined on the left. And again, once you go through the projects, you'll be able to see how we are proposing this work. And finally, the other remaining 11% of the projects must report on whether projects are primarily serving disproportionately impacted communities. And for the work that I feel a little bit more confident speaking on is how we are defining the word equity and how we want to expand the definition that ARPA is providing, the U.S. Treasury, is providing for us. And we're saying that equity is a proactive process, is an action of providing historically excluded communities the resources they need and live in the city of Boston and thrive in the city of Boston. I will say I'm current partnership with the Economic Opportunity and Inclusion Cabinet as well as the BPDA to ensure that we are doing some resource mapping around data collection and resource mapping so we can identify where our communities lie right now during the pandemic and post-pandemic when it comes to issues of wealth, and also doing a little bit of digging into what are the current resources internally and externally to really focus on the impact and how we can support our communities, especially the ones that we are focusing on. And I know that this council cares a lot about. And I'm really excited to be working in partnership with the team here, right here with me, the administration and finance team, to ensure that the departments that are receiving these ARPA funds are implementing programming, policies, services that are research-based, that are data-oriented, and that are, when we're looking at data, it's also qualitative data, and that it's, let me back up. I have heard a lot of the questions and I have read a lot of the questions that have come from the council, and I want to thank you all for pushing us in this way. It has really helped me really think about the way that we build out a lot of these projects, et cetera. And so I'm taking this information from you all as well to ensure that when we're sitting down with the different cabinet leadership, we are setting anticipated outcomes that we are expecting to see and we can actually track throughout the time of the different projects. A few other things that we're doing is we're actually getting very clear on what our definition of historically excluded communities are, beyond sort of the federal definitions. And then collaboratively setting anticipated outcomes, as I've said. Just today I was in a meeting with several of the chiefs to ensure that we are having this conversation for now before the money is hopefully allocated, and that we're talking about what is culturally and linguistically competent outreach that is also equitable, that we're looking at different data around zip codes, et cetera, so that we can be doing, so that we engage in proactive outreach to our communities. And yeah, just thinking about how we can do an ongoing community engagement and evaluation process throughout the next couple of years as these projects unfold. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So finally, I think I wanted to spend we want to spend some time today walking through the major investments proposed by the mayor that meet some of those key values we described above and will be implemented in partnership with Equity and Inclusion Cabinet and many other cabinet leaders who are not here today. Together, this plan includes $349.5 million in transformative investments for Boston. And you'll see the high-level numbers here on the screen in front of you, and we're going to dive into each of them, so I won't spend too much time on this slide. It's also worth noting, though, that for those listening, this is all outlined on our website, boston.gov/recover, and there is a 2-pager with this information that's translated into 12 languages as well. So let's start in first, on housing, which is a really, really exciting investment that is part of an unprecedented commitment of $380 million from the operating and capital budgets, along with the $206 for affordable housing from the Arpa funding. I want to thank many of you here today on the council, as well as many of the advocates we've heard from over the past few months for their work on this issue. These resources will leave a tangible legacy in Boston from new supportive housing with services for people with substance use disorder, quality of life upgrades that are desperately needed in over 1,000 units in BHA across the city, and new deeply affordable development on city-owned land, not to mention $60 million for affordable home ownership, as well as additional acquisition to combat displacement along transit corridors. There is also about $34 million to promote economic opportunity and inclusion. I'm really excited about Chief Iduu's vision that includes building a $10 million fund to create a stronger ecosystem to grow diverse employer forms and $4 million to further invest in our Main Street business districts. These are just a couple of examples that I wanted to highlight. And I would say in general, right, as we were kind of bucketing these investments into categories, it's a little bit of, this is a little bit of an underestimate, I would say, because this work is so cross-functional. So for example, there are about 30 million plus investments in workforce development that are sprinkled across all of the categories that we're going to run through today. So in reality, right, this work is so cross-functional, it feels a little bit false to bucket them, but we wanted to try and provide an overview here today. Okay. In climate and mobility, which is a $31.5 million overall investment in climate resilience and mobility. That includes $6 million to scale the Youth Green Jobs program and $2.5 million to strengthen our local food systems through new rooftop farms, raised bed gardens in low-income communities, and an expanded farmers market coupon program for low-income residents who don't have access to other safety net programs. We are also proposing $20 million to continue response to the COVID-19 pandemic. For vaccination, testing, surge planning, and other COVID-19 response activities. On the bottom, you'll see we've kind of highlighted some paired operating budget investments, and Jim can speak more to these, but the FY23 operating budget also includes $32 million in investments for public health preparedness and funding for 20 additional EMTs. In arts and culture, we are proposing $20 million to strengthen BIPOC-led cultural organizations and activate our neighborhoods and public spaces in the downtown and across the city. And finally, we are bringing some very exciting resources to bear in behavioral health. It's an issue we've heard about in council hearings, in our listening sessions, and that there's a greater need for coordination and supports in the behavioral health field. And as in response, BPHC will develop a new center for behavioral health and wellness that will train a culturally responsive workforce and ensure a community-driven response. This is also paired with a proposed investment of staff in the new Center for Behavioral Health and Wellness in the FY23 operating budget. Finally, we are also bringing resources to bear on early childhood. There's $15 million proposed here today to focus on early education in the child care system through workforce development, supporting the centers themselves who we know are financially struggling, and streamlining access and enrollment for families. And again, this is also paired with the newly created Office of Early Childhood in the FY23 operating budget. And finally, last but not least, we propose investing $5 million to administer these ARPA funds effectively and equitably. This is 0.9 of the overall ARPA funds and just 1.4% of the proposal in front of us today. This is below the national average of 5% based on an analysis of other cities and counties receiving funds. We think is really important to meeting the goals that the chief shared earlier around infusing equity into program design, practice, and implementation. So to do so, we would propose using the funds to fund impact studies and program evaluations to ensure that we're not leaving at the end of 2026 without a sense of what we've learned and how we can improve. 4 temporary staff positions through 2026 when the ARPA funds must be spent to support equity, analytics, engagement, and of course, compliance with the federal guidelines. Additional funds for language access across all ARPA-funded programs to ensure that there's no barrier in the culturally competent outreach that we want to be doing, and reserving some money for required audit services as well. So that concludes our presentation today. I know we ran through all the investments rather quickly, but I wanted this really to be an overview, knowing that we are going to spend a lot of time talking through each of the issue areas with the council in the coming month or two. So appreciate your time today and look forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chief and Jim and Casey. So I will have, for tomorrow when we have council meeting, in my summary of this hearing, I'll have for folks the dates of the next 3 hearings, but just so people have a sense, if you go back to the listing of buckets, we're anticipating that we're gonna have, like I said, a dedicated hearing on the housing, a hearing on climate, a hearing on the public health, both the equitable response and the behavioral and mental health, and a hearing that puts economic opportunity, inclusion, arts and culture, and early ed together. So, and we will have the appropriate chiefs and staff for each department there. So what I would love for counselors to do is, if you have questions on those specific buckets today, put them on the record, and we'll basically use this as sort of like a working session for those future hearings. And so I don't want us to spend too much time spinning wheels on questions that are really for the chiefs of these other departments, who the folks with us today may not know the chapter and verse on, but it would be helpful to the committee if people would put those things on the record to the extent that you already have them. Obviously, you know, questions about how this interacts with the budget and sort of the overall focus of it and the equity and implementation stuff, all of that, totally fair game. But I'm just going to flag at the outset that we know that the panel that we have before us today is not expert on all of the detail level of the proposals. And before I turn to questions, I just want to note we were joined way back, actually right before the presentation began, by Councilor Ruth C. Lujan at large. And I also wanted to acknowledge Councilor Michael Flaherty at large. He's the vice chair of this committee, but he was also the chair of this committee when the fall listening sessions were held, and really kind of piloted this committee through its first year of existence. And so I just wanted to credit Michael, and also say that for folks who are new, I think Michael's probably our expert on the council on sort of what those conversations were like last year and the things that came up and all of that. So just wanted to emphasize that, and I'll let him speak to that in his comments. But I think I will hold my questions to the end and go to colleagues. Since we've got good attendance today, I'm going to try to keep everybody to 7 minutes in the first round, and then we'll see where we are. So first up, and the order I'll just read once so people have it. It's Flynn, Braden, Baker, Murphy, Flaherty, Fernandez-Henderson, Worrell, Mejia, Louis-Jean. So start with Council President Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councilor Bach, and to Councilor Flaherty for the important work, and to the body, and to Mayor Wu's team as well. Important work that you're all doing. I was just looking at the broadband infrastructure and the impact it has on, especially residents living in public housing, the digital equity related issues. I know there's an opportunity to use some funds to upgrade, or advance technology, so people, especially in difficult to reach areas such as public housing, have equal access to digital equity. I've heard during the pandemic that a lot of kids, or students I should say, were kind of kicked off their computer, their lessons, if more than one child was working at a time, and it only had enough power for one person, then the other student, that brother or the sister, couldn't access the system. That's a big concern. That's an issue I've worked on with a group called Tech Goes Home as well. But digital equity to residents in the public housing is an important issue, along with the residents that live in kind of like large apartment buildings as well, hard to reach areas. Myself and Councilor Baker represent Mary Ellen McCormick, mostly Councilor Baker. I represent Old Colony and West Broadway, but we want to make sure our residents in public housing and Cathedral as well, Villa Victoria, but we want to make sure residents in public housing have equal access to digital equity. And just give me a snapshot on what that means in terms of some of this funding that might help out some of these students.
Thanks. Thank you, Councilor, for that question. So I will say, and Councilor Flaherty is well aware of this as well from the conversations last year, there was a $1 million investment in digital equity, specifically in public housing, that was passed last year. I will defer to the BHA folks to talk about where they are in the implementation process of that funding, but I know that was targeted to specifically address the need that you're talking about. One of the other things that we want to think about too is what are the resources outside CSLFRF ARPA funds for digital equity and for our public housing residents, and we are really excited about the investment in the Emergency Connectivity Fund that was through ARPA but not under CSLFRF. So that includes $12 million for Boston at the school through schools and libraries, and I know our libraries team is specifically focusing on distributing Chromebooks and home routers to BHA residents and working very closely with the BHA team to do that. In addition, we're also trying to explore ramping up the number of Boston residents who are accessing the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides direct financial support to low-income households who are seeking better connectivity. To date, we have about 21,000 almost Boston households who are enrolled in that program. And then finally, I would say the other piece of the equation is, of course, the infrastructure bill. And what are the opportunities for exploring additional resources for broadband in that bill. So I think there are, beyond just the resources that we're talking about today, we're trying to maximize the resources that Boston residents get across a variety of different pools of funds as well.
Thank you. Excellent answer. And I should have mentioned, well, two things I should have mentioned. I held a hearing on it with Councilor Mejia on digital equity last year. It was a very good hearing, but we had testimony from a group of young students from Castle Square. They did an outstanding job. So I just wanted to mention that. And then my final point, Boston has old water and sewer infrastructure. A lot of it is in rough shape, and needs to be upgraded. We want to make sure we have clean water and a sewer system that properly works. But just thinking long-term, are we able to fix or at least have a discussion about our sewer system using any of these funds?
A great question. I am not an expert in the sewer system, but what I will say is from a funding perspective, right, we are also tracking the variety of opportunities in the infrastructure bill, specifically related to clean and healthy water, again, to try and maximize resources across a bunch of these different programs.
Yeah, thank you. I'm working with Councilor Baker and Councilor Fernandez-Anderson, especially in the south end on water and sewer related issues. The concern we have is the sewers are so old and they're in rough shape, and we're working with the water and sewer department now. But you know, maybe it's a conversation we can have down the line, but what role some of these funds may provide as it relates to upgrades to water and sewer infrastructure. It's desperately needed in the city, not just in the south end, but throughout the city. But just want to say thank you to the administration for the work that you're doing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Flynn. And I just want to flag that it is the intention of this committee to be following up specifically on the federal infrastructure bill and making sure that Boston's taking full advantage of all of those competitive grants, because you're right, those capital needs are huge and they're way beyond what the $350 million could cover, but we feel like we should be getting every opportunity. Okay, next up is Councillor Braden, and then it'll be Councillor Baker. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. This is an exciting conversation to be having, and it's a blessing to have so much potential benefit at our fingertips here as we consider all this expenditure. I'm just thinking the city must obligate ARPA funds by December 31st, 2024. That's the end of the second quarter, and the funds must be expended by December 31st, 2026, the end of the second quarter in financial year 2026. That would be a potential lifespan of over 14 fiscal quarters. That's a long time, and it's a short time at the same time. Which components of the Mayor's plan would be expended only in financial year 2023? I'm trying to disaggregate, you know, putting it all together with this year's financial year 23 budget it's difficult to sort of disaggregate it and trying to figure out how we will stage the spending and how we can sustain it through the end of the eligibility period. And are there components of the proposal that may start as pilot programs or initial allocations which have the potential to be sustained going forward past 2026 in the city's operating budget when the funds run out? We don't want to sort of hit this financial cliff that we fall off. We've had something that's really great and then bang, it's gone. So those are two of my concerns.
Great question. So on the second one first, I think you're right? We want to make sure that we have we're putting ourselves in good fiscal shape beyond 2026. There are some things in here that are pilots. I think, for example, the Youth Green Jobs Program, we invested $3 million last year to get that up and running. There's another $6 million in this package of investments to scale that program, and that number was based on some work we've done with the Philadelphia Power Corps program to understand kind of what their life cycle looked like of what they needed to get to scale. And then they started doing external fundraising and became independent or less dependent on city funding. So that kind of, we're hoping to create a trajectory over the long term for some of these pilots where it's not just the city budget that is coming in at the end of this, but it could be state funds, federal funds, and other resources to bring to bear. But this is an opportunity to try things out in a new way, like you said, and so we do want to pilot some of those new ideas as well. And then remind me your first question.
The one is, you know, it's we have funds to expend over 14 fiscal quarters.
Yes.
We're sort of front loading it right now. It seems like how are we going to portion it out over the period of time? And also one concern is you know, in terms of the housing question, it takes a while to plan and implement housing, you know, to actually get bricks and mortar. My concern is that do we have enough time to really seriously expend that money on housing development?
Yeah, I think each of these projects that we've talked about today does have a slightly different spending curve, right? Or they're each going to have a different cadence for how they're able to spend money, just based on the program design and implementation. And you're right, you know, Chief Dillon is itching to get going on spending this money because we know it's going to be hard work to spend these dollars down, but we need and want to do that. As we thought about putting this proposal forward, I think you should think about the numbers for each program as our best estimate of what is needed through the end of ARPA, right? This rate, like we said, this is the majority of the remaining funds minus the $19.7 million that is in reserve. So we really wanted to work with our cabinet heads and leaders to shape out what does it look like over the next 3 years, which also gives our program partners, nonprofits in the community, certainty that there will be funding over the next, you know, through the end of the ARPA term. So these numbers, you know, each of the individual projects may have a slightly different spending curve, but these numbers are through the end of 2026.
And, you know, so then you know, I know we're going to have further hearings about putting it in different buckets. So one thing I'd be looking for when we come to those next hearings is to really look at how the funds will be distributed into what accounts, and then to be presented with departmental line items and organizational codes and categories of expenses that we will have to vote on ultimately. You know, to have a better idea of, okay, that's a big pot of money, like how are we going to break it down, and how it's going to be targeted at specific line items. And I'm sure I've run out of time, Madam Chair.
You're very close.
Very close. Okay.
You have another minute. if you want.
Another minute? Okay. The other thing, another concern, you know, we have additional federal funding opportunities in the infrastructure law. That's and do we have a strategy to be a strong contender for those competitive and discretionary grants? And do we have an intergovernmental strategy with the state agencies? You know, we just mentioned water and sewer. State agencies or quasi-public agencies to maximize our potential for these transformative projects. You know, I'm thinking in my district, we have the I-90 infrastructure project. We should be coordinating with MassDOT on that. Some grants will require a local match, so we can use those ARPA funds for matching funds to attract grants. The other concern I have, you know, our grant making capacity, we get grants awarded to us, but the other concern I have is we have to make sure that we have project managers on the ground, hired, staffed up, so that they can actually spend the money. It's an embarrassment when one of our city departments has to send the money back because we didn't have a project manager to actually implement this, the project and spend the money. So those are concerns I have as well, because this is a lot of money.
Agreed.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Baker, and then it'll be Councillor Murphy. Councillor Baker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Who comes up with the key values? Do they come down from the feds, or is that internal key values? I think there's 8 of them. 9 of them.
So obviously, like, whether it's eligible for ARPA spending, that comes from the federal government, but the majority of those values are an internal document to help us think about, right, amongst a lot of choices, how to move forward.
So with the Arpa eligibility, and then, so Arpa eligibility, fiscal sustainability, probably lasting legacy, how do we justify paying for bus routes, 3 bus routes, when it's not, from my understanding, that it's not Arpa eligible because they're not supposed to spend on something that becomes going to be a long-term liability in all probability to us as the City of Boston. So that's one question. How do we right off the bat Arpa eligibility, spend $8 million on that, and then I see another $2 million someplace else going towards the same thing? So that $2 million for year 4, what is that $2 million there?
Sure. The $2 million that you're referring to in the $349.5 million package is for cross-jurisdictional routes. So I can't
So the
speak-
branches off of those bus routes?
No, not necessarily. Well, they may connect to those bus routes. I'm not an expert on the maps, but my understanding is that there's cities from Brookline to Chelsea to other cities or Cambridge that are interested in also pursuing this work with the MBTA, and those routes would cross into our jurisdiction as well.
So, but how do we spend that money when it's in direct conflict with the federal law?
So the Arpa eligibility criteria, right, that specific project falls under, and I can pull the code
Yeah,
for
I don't need
you.
the specific project, I just, and you can get back to me
Yeah.
on that if it's,
Yeah.
because to me, it looks like it conflicts.
So it fits under what's called basically negative economic impacts to households, right? And there's also some public health impacts. And so that's how it is eligible for ARPA spending. I understand your concerns about, right, the fiscal
Because it's a liability
sustainability question.
in 3 years, correct?
It is a liability in 3 years, but that's why this is a pilot that we are learning from. We are trying to understand, and we are also working in conjunction with our state and federal partners to come up with a long-term funding solution that doesn't entirely rely on the city. So I understand your concerns, but I think that's why we are pursuing this pilot to learn and
Yeah,
understand
and
the
I mean,
impacts.
your third key value is fiscal sustainability. Obviously not, because it's gonna come right out of our budget in 3 years, year 4. So just wanna make that point. If we can go to behavioral health here, you've got 12 million to develop a new center. Is that an actual building a new center, or what is that? That's 12 million going towards what?
Yes, that is, and there will be a specific hearing on this, but I'll speak at a high level.
Yeah.
It is not building.
So it's not a new program, building, space?
No, it's not, but it is, I would think of it as a new initiative within the city, and there will be, as I mentioned, staffing in the operating investment that Jim can speak to complement this work. But the ARPA funding specifically will be focused on a few things. One, the behavioral health workforce. We know that is a huge issue for our community. Health centers, as well as our nonprofit partners, is recruiting.
So
culturally
accessibility,
competent.
behavioral health workforce, that would be like, what's the name of the place on Beach Street? I can't come up with it.
Okay.
We can, huh? No, Jim Cassetta's place. Sorry.
Sorry, we can't.
Yeah,
It's okay.
sorry. Okay, so 12 million for that.
Yep.
6 million to support ongoing substance use and mental health crisis. Another 20 million over here so now I'm at 38 million for permanent supportive housing with specialized services for people with substance use disorder. Over and above what we've already spent, and I'd like to get the number, what we've spent on the Roundhouse, and the other hotels, because if we're spending this money for supportive housing and we're somehow asking them to try to be sober going into this, I'm all on board. But I think the model that we're pursuing now is gonna be good money spent after bad money. If we're going to allow the system that is Roundhouse, so it's basically just come off the street and come right in here. And I don't think, even though they tell us there are people, I don't think that the majority of those people are from Boston. So we're investing, from what I can see, just in all these 38 million, not including what we've already spent on Roundhouse, not including what we've already spent on everything else. So we're up around 40 or 50 million now, probably. Correct? On ARPA money so far?
That sounds right. Yep.
Okay. With that being said, I don't see anything else that speaks to any other area of society that is going through the mental health issues. I don't see anything for kids. I don't see anything for seniors. That's why when I talk about my field house here, I wonder why you guys are dead silent on it. Because it's going to speak to issues before they become issues. When kids are young, we need to be investing in them. So I would like an official answer on where my request for the field house money is gonna be, if you even know about it. That's one thing. I just, a lot of talk about all the involvement that you've had with community and advocates and this and that. Not one question from the administration. Where would you like to see some money go? I'm a city councilor, and I'd like to challenge. Has anybody else been asked where 350 million, 500 million, 800 million is going, because we still have the school department money, that we haven't been asked anything where we want? Of course we all want housing, of course we want mental health supports, but there may be things within people's districts where they want. There may be specific asks where this money could, back to our key values, lasting legacy. The field house in Columbia Point, which is an opportunity zone, which is a zone that is in purple now, so there's family in need down there. Lasting legacy, fiscally sustainable, Arpa eligible, urgent challenge, racial equity. So it speaks to almost all of them. So I'd like to know where you guys are on the request for the field house. Because this money just seems like it's gone, and we're an afterthought. The city council is an afterthought on this.
Yep.
Maybe I'm the only one that feels that way, but I certainly do feel that way.
Okay.
So where is my request? And my last question would be, so if we're talking about having meetings, and this is to you, I don't know if I would go through you to you, but when we're having an actual, we talked about trunkets of money. Are these the trunkets we're talking about here? And we're gonna vote on those, so that's 9 votes, maybe if you can, and not now, but speak it to
I'll
some
do it
point.
after. Why doesn't Casey answer this question?
Yeah, so I think when I wasn't able to join in person, but I did listen to the hearing that you hosted on the field house.
Did you really listen to it?
I really did
Did you
listen
watch
to
it?
it. I told Counselor Bach this
She did.
afterwards
Okay.
too. I really listened to it.
Because everybody
I
says
can
they watch, well, they watch
No,
that
no,
stuff, and
no,
you know
I
what, they don't
watched.
watch it.
I watched, and it was great, wonderful just to hear more learn more about it. And I think as the counselor talked about at the beginning, and some of the I know other counselors have filed other hearing orders related to the ARPA funding. And so I think that's part of this process is going to have to be a conversation about how we think about spending across the $350 million. It is a limited source of funds, so there are trade-offs, right? That's the conversation that we're going to be having over the next month. So I
Right,
don't have a specific answer for you today on
And that's why I pointed
it,
out the
but
behavioral health at the beginning.
Yeah.
If we're right now almost at 50 million bucks spending on what's happening down at Mass and Cass, and we haven't built one detox bed, we haven't built one sober step-up bed, we haven't, it's all about keeping them in the state of long-term suicide is what they're all doing down there. Because it's only a matter of time before it finally gets them, and we're allowing the behaviors to happen. We don't have any Section 12 beds, we have no Section 35 beds, we're not building any of those things, sorry. Okay,
Thank you.
my time is up.
For other counselors, when I raise my gavel like this, it indicates that your time has elapsed. Yeah, I'm just gonna say very briefly to Counselor Baker's question, the entire point is that while the administration has proposed a full slate of things to expend the full $350 million, what the council is doing over the coming hearings is deliberating about how we would like to, in partnership with the mayor, spend the $350 million. And I do anticipate that is going to mean.
That's just my time.
No,
I have
that's,
more time.
no, that's the extreme backup alarm, which nobody else should get to. Basically, the idea is basically that we're gonna, I expect this docket to change. The administration made a decision, which I think is fair, to say, if we just got to decide, here's how we think we should spend the $350 million. They have put that out into the public forum, and now we are going to have a series of public conversations for counselors to say how they want it, for the public to come and testify. We're going to hear in a minute from the nonprofit sector. This is the transparent conversation about how Boston is going to spend its remaining ARPA funds, and it is going to happen over a series of hearings in the coming months. I'm going now to Councillor Murphy, and then it will be Councillor Flaherty.
Yes.
Councillor Murphy?
Thank you. I always love going after Councilor Baker. Thank you. So thank you, Chair, and thank you for this overview. It's very helpful. You know, this is a historic opportunity. It's going to allow our city to build a stronger, more united Boston. I propose that we invest these funds in comprehensive long-term capital and a public health plan. I hope that with this money, we're going to rebuild, refresh, and reinvest in Boston's buildings, public spaces, and in our people. We need to be bold and inclusive, and that will put people first. I want to see that our children, our elders, and our most vulnerable residents are included in this, and we don't leave anyone behind. And that being said, I would like to go on record on how I would like to see this money spent. I would love to see $75 million for a women's shelter and a comprehensive substance use recovery facility in Boston for our women. $10 million to expand mental and emotional health services for our seniors and veterans. $10 million for nonprofits who are working in the recovery space already. I do see the Phoenix here. Thank you for being here. They're a sober, active community. And how are we supporting our existing nonprofits who are already doing the work in this space and making sure that we're giving them the information they need to connect to these funds? I'd love to see $20 million for pre-K classrooms in BPS buildings, making our universal pre-K a reality. $20 million for upgrades in our after-school programming that standardize quality enrichment opportunities for students in every neighborhood. $10 million to renovate and upgrade community centers with internet cafes for all seniors, immigrants, school kids, and others, so that we can bring free of charge internet and tech resources to all who need it in the city of Boston. I would like to see $20 million for waterfront public spaces and pools to expand our swimming, boating, and recreational options. It would be great to see an outdoor swimming pool in every neighborhood. We are Boston, we are on the waterfront, and we have had hearings, and here at this council meeting, we talk about how so many of our residents don't have access to or know how to swim. $20 million to build out public performance and art spaces in our parks and public squares, and $10 million in equipment, facilities, and programming for physical activities and wellness opportunities for our seniors that are living in BHA housing and community centers. I would also want to go on record that I hope that we definitely put $10 million to the Boys and Girls Martin Richard Fieldhouse in Dorchester in Columbia Square. So my two questions, I guess, is will you consider any of my requests? But the other question is, and I know we'll hear from nonprofits next, is how are we going to support our nonprofits? That this money is here and we need to hear from them and to support them in the process also. So thank you.
Great. I think, of course, you know, as Councillor Bach outlined, we expect to kind of approach that in some of the hearings going forward, the 4 or 5 hearings that we have scheduled going forward. So looking forward to learning more about each of the specific buckets that you're talking about and what's included in there. So happy to learn more. In terms of kind of how we're thinking about supporting our nonprofit community, as I think back about the package that the council appropriated last year and the package that we're talking about here today, both of them include nonprofits as key partners to get resources to our communities. So whether we're talking about the basic needs assistance for immigrant families that was funded last year, the food access grants that our Office of Food Justice did and put out $3 million in grants to that specific community, a series of grants that BPHC did focused on the social determinants of health. All of those were funded by ARPA. And similarly, there are a variety of different programs that we're talking about here today that will rely on the expertise of our nonprofit partners and support them in their work. You know, this is right, we've talked about this being an all funds approach, but it's also an all kind of partners approach too, because we're going to need our nonprofit partners to help us. They're such an important part of our work every day, but also they will be in this ARPA package as well.
Thank you. That's all, Chair.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Murphy. Next up, Councillor Flaherty, again, my vice chair, and then it'll be Councillor Fernandez-Henderson. Councillor Flaherty?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this hearing and for your kind words recognizing my involvement in this space. This hearing and these funds it's a good news story, and we have the opportunity to help and improve the quality of life for Bostonians across the city. It's between these funds and obviously our operating and our capital budget. So a lot of great opportunities on the horizon. I think the challenge for us, as you're starting to hear, is determining which projects to support and which funding and how we can most effectively communicate with the residents and taxpayers about how we are spending the money. The knock that we're getting right now is everyone has heard about these funds, but they're not seeing the funds hit the streets. They're not seeing the funds in action. I think therein lies a little bit of the problem there. And I would ask you to probably, and I've mentioned this before, take a page maybe out of CPA's book, and it's how we were able to, I guess, kick it off, which is that we sort of focused on the shovel-ready projects because they were real and they were tangible, and when we started to see the fruits of CPA play itself out across the city, people were able to easily connect with CPA, and then we started to see more folks apply, and then even more folks apply, and then in the next round, even more folks apply. So it was its own billboard, arguably, that once folks start to see the Arpa funds hitting the streets and things that it can make a difference in, and then therein lies more opportunities open themselves up. So that would be just a sort of a piece of advice, very similar to how we got the CPA off the ground. Just maybe a little deeper dive on the Arpa funds. How much of the Arpa funds have gone to support programmatic operations such as sort of staffing and funding for city programs, and how much of the Arpa funds have been used to match existing funds for programs? Sort of thinking about the acquisition opportunity program as an example of that.
Yep. I don't have those numbers, that exact breakdown in front of me today, so I don't want to misspeak on it, but I'm happy to pull those numbers.
That'd be great if we can get that through the chair, it'd be awesome. And then are there ARPA funds that are being used to support and supplement BPS programs and staffing? For example, I know that we have the BPS food distribution that worked, and I know that that's one of the ARPA funds intent. Also, are we supporting ongoing personnel investments that have advocated, that we've advocated all collectively for in the operating budget around social workers and psychologists, et cetera? And if so, can we get a full breakdown of those funds, the ARPA funds that have been used in that space?
Yes, so I think what you're referring to is there was a partnership between the Office of Food Justice and BPS on the food program. There was $90,000 allocated towards it last year. There was a $2 million that was allocated for counselors in every school and to make sure that a full-time person was in every school, and that is being spent down as we speak. The payroll every week hits that line item, and we're spending that down. And then finally, I believe there was a line item for family supports as well at BPS. I can't speak to that line item specifically here today, but happy to report back on it.
Right, and it's timely. Obviously, we had that hearing yesterday. Chairwoman Anderson held that, and I know that those are some of the questions we sort of dove in on in terms of those reoccurring costs. Clearly, we need more social workers. We need more school psychologists. We clearly need that family support that has lacked in prior budgets. So we're starting to kind of get our hands and head around funding those appropriate programs that are making a difference. Clearly, we need more of them. My concern is just making sure that if the ARPA funds are being used, at some point they run out, and we obviously need to be there to back that up if there's a gap on that front. So the reoccurring piece of it and the reality around that the ARPA funds are only going to last so long, making sure we get our best bang for the buck, but also when the funds run out, that we don't leave a department or an agency or a program high and dry and then have to shift their gears and come running down here for us to make up the difference, particularly if we're going to start to see the economy take a dip possibly, and if we're going to go into a recession that may be problematic for future budgets. So just want to make sure that you guys are sort of thinking long-term, big picture. And lastly, just go on record again of supporting the Martin Richard field house out at the Columbia Point Harbor Point Peninsula. Totally would be transformational for so many young boys and girls that either live across the street or are from Dorchester or the neighboring Mary Ellen McCormick. I know it as the Old Harbor Projects where I was born, but talk about being able to service some of our most vulnerable residents with tremendous partnership opportunities with BC High and University of Massachusetts and all the new development and opportunity that's coming online at the Bayside Expo Center off of Mount Vernon Street. This would be a perfect complement to that, and I see that the shaded area has the entire peninsula in purple, but I also noticed that Somerville, Cambridge, and Chelsea were there, and nothing against those folks, but I want to make sure our resources aren't going to those areas. We have a lot of need here, so I saw that.
That's just the federal
Very
map,
good.
so
Just
don't
want to
worry.
make sure that was the case, that we weren't spreading ourselves too thin to other neighboring communities that don't call Boston home. But that said, I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I know that you're getting pulled in 1,000 directions. Add the council to 1,001 directions. We clearly were out there listening to folks. We have a responsibility to our constituents and to the residents and taxpayers. There are things I think that each of us individually want or collectively working together to try to make sure that those funds, again, hit the streets and they start to make a difference in people's lives. And that's the goal here. This is a good news story, but it can get a little tense and an arm wrestling match as to where we think it should go. We all have our own opinions. End of the day, it's great for Boston to have this funding. We're blessed, obviously, to have this one-time opportunity to help a lot of folks, and that's what this is about. So thank you again for your time and talents, and look forward to working with you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Flaherty. Next up is Councillor Fernandez-Anderson, and then it'll be Councillor Worrell. Councillor Fernandez-Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if you can, hi, how y'all doing over there?
Hello, hello.
Good. All right. I wonder if y'all can give me or can submit a budget sheet for the actual, like everything together. And then if you can aggregate in terms of the projects itself, where they're going, so that we are getting ahead of it. I think that, so 89% is supposed to be, according to what I'm reading here, and I saw it in the language, right, from the state, like in terms of equity and stuff like that. So 89% is needs to go to like equity, and so if that's the case, then 11% to a study or to assessing whether or not we did that properly. And if that's the case, then shouldn't we be getting ahead of it? And I personally feel that, one, a budget sheet, two, for each project, location to who it's going to impact, right? We can make that assessment based on your proposal of equity, in terms of where it's going, who is it gonna serve, population, location, by neighborhood, by district, all of that. And then the other thing too is, I hear my councilor colleague, Frank Baker, speak, and I have to say that I would have liked the same. I would have liked conversations to include the council in the planning, in the ideas. And because where we have it all in front of us and it's all one big bucket to vote on, I personally don't feel comfortable in having a conversation of one big bucket. If it was a conversation, each hearing separate on each project, then we could properly assess it. Because here's the thing, the language of equity, the language of, all this transformative, equity, racial justice. I think I second one of my colleagues when they said, I'm tired of hearing that word equity. Just so tired of it. Because honestly, if we can't properly assess that it's actually gonna go to the people that we say it's gonna go to, it's performative, right? Like, so we want, not that we don't trust administration and how we do things, but that we as a city have a pattern of doing things systemically racist. So if that's the case, the conversation should really be more transparent in terms of, let's assess it first and let's get a full breakdown of where these things are going. And so to speak to my other point about including or engaging the council in the whole planning, it's really hard as a new councilor to come in to vote on things that we didn't have a say in. So it's like, yeah, of course, we all want housing. I want all these things. I love these ideas, right? But how do I know what this will look like? How do I know? Like, I wasn't a part of it. I don't fully understand it because it's just a presentation in a matter of minutes. How do I know what I'm voting on, right? And so I've read it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then the only thing that leads me to is like, okay, wait a minute. But the counselors have also been filing things, and if they haven't filed, they're planning on filing. They have ideas. That takes organizing. That takes a lot of meetings, a lot of time, a lot of phone calls, networking, meeting with counselors. So Counselor Lujan and Counselor Murphy, we filed something. Frank Baker filed something, right? So all of this takes a lot of our time. So over months' time, we've been planning and organizing too. So to get to a hearing where it's like, oh, well, here, the whole thing, we want the whole thing. Wait a minute. Can we just talk about one allocation at a time? Because this whole, really take the whole thing, then how does that involve us? So what are we here for? Like, that's how I feel as a new counselor, and I'm trying to understand if this is the pattern or if this is normal. If this is how government performs. Is this democracy? Is this how it's done? I am trying to learn, right? I'm trying to understand. And if that's the case, then, you know, if I feel left out, if I feel as a Black woman from Roxbury that my decision, only when I get to vote on somebody else's decision, not my decision, not my planning, not my time, not my advocacy, none of that, hey, listen, put that to rest. You're just a counselor. It doesn't matter. And that, I think, is a mutual sentiment from a lot of us. And I think that needs to change. It's worth a conversation. It's worth more networking. And maybe just, you know, slow down a bit, engage us on a different level, not in a hearing, not in this way, because this is not the way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you guys respond?
Sure. I think, right, this is just an overview hearing, and I even personally was struggling because I felt, you know, as we went through all the different programs, it's not doing the work justice to rush through a slide that talks about, you know, the $200 million plus in housing in less than a minute, right? So that's why we are going to be having specific focus hearings where we can dig in on the details. However, what we can do is share just a simple spreadsheet that has more description and details about each of the specific projects. You can dig in and understand more what's behind, obviously, this high-level information that we're sharing here today. So happy to provide you with that.
Thank you.
Like I said, this is the beginning of the conversation. We're putting a proposal forward, and
There'll be 3 more hearings, right?
I think 4, 5? I can't remember.
Our initial plan is to try to make sure that we have had a hearing. So I think we've got 4 more and we're sort of pairing up those buckets so that there's been at least an initial hearing on each topic area before the budget vote, because we know these things are enough in tandem that we wanted people to kind of have all that on the table. But I think what I anticipate, Counselor, is that we will end up having like follow-up further working sessions. Like, I don't anticipate that it'll just end with the 4 hearings, but I do think that we wanted to get everything out on the table so that people weren't thinking about budget being like, wait, what's the actual detail on that thing that the administration's proposing?
Right. So what that does is delay everybody else, because until this is handled, then all of our ideas or whatever we have been working on, forget it. It doesn't include it because it's a hearing on these ideas on the full bucket. What I'm saying is, and what I'm suggesting is that either we're included and our ideas are included in this proposal. And I understand it's an overview. I understand it, and listen, I know like you're here presenting, like this is not personal, right? I'm saying that we go back to the table and that we do this together. And that I haven't heard of one community process in my district asking about this stuff. So I don't know what this is. So I don't know what this community process, when did it happen? When, what school, what housing, what town, where? I don't know. So I'm saying, I'm being honest with you. I'm pouring out my heart and I'm saying, I want to be a part of this, but I want to be a part of this in a real way where I can properly,
I have so many organizations, so many nonprofits that's contacted me, that's met with me, hearing sessions. Councilor Mejia has done it. Councilor Ruzzi has talked about it. Councilor Murphy, Councilor Frank Baker. We've all have so many people, list of community people, constituents talking about this, but not in the reverse. I have not heard this community engagement at all. So if that's an issue, right? And if you guys have done it, and I believe you, I'm saying, how come I haven't heard of it? And if that's the case, how do we together talk about a process that actually works, that we don't feel this way? Because if we feel this way, that's a real thing. That's my reality, right? And so your reality is that you're saying you've done it and this is a proposal and it's a great idea. It's a beautiful idea. Great. We have great ideas too. Well, how then can we continue with these hearings? For what? It doesn't include us.
I think our hope is, and Councilor, correct me if I'm wrong, we're hoping to talk about the ideas that the council is putting forward along, so when we have a housing hearing, right, the administration will talk about the ideas that it's going to be putting forward in conjunction with the ideas
With
that
counselor
the
ideas about
counselors have
housing.
been working on, so that, right, going forward, they're kind of in more in conjunction, like you're saying, so that we're talking about all of the ideas around housing together at one hearing.
I feel like we're being squeezed in the couch. Like, I grew up with a big family too. So like we all get squeezed, like, like squeeze over. I got, can I get this little piece of, on the couch? And so as long as I can squeeze on the couch, that's fine. But I wonder then, who's gonna be squeezed out? So the math says the full bucket, but you're saying you're willing to squeeze some people out of the couch, or some ideas, so we can fit our ideas. On record, you're saying you're open to having these conversations and figuring out how we can involve our ideas. Then how come you didn't just leave like 100 million open and say that's for the council?
I think we wanted to put our best proposal forth today and then start the public conversations. I look forward to the conversation over the next month.
That's the backup of the backup. Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate you.
Can I respond briefly? Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry to
Just
interrupt.
briefly.
Yeah. Thank you for the imagery of the squeezing out of the couch. I can see my cousins doing that. I just want to sort of say that I heard you on the piece around like, what are we doing? Sort of, what's the data? And I that's what I was saying earlier. For me, that's why I've been a little bit quiet. The technicalities and the numbers. They're the experts here. I want to be listening here to the questions. That's what I've been typing the questions you're asking, so that I'm thinking more of like the midterm, long-term game around how do we change the budget conversation that you have been really spearheading. Because I want to make sure that we are able to say this much money went to this specific zip code and help this amount of single mothers raising children, right? Like that's the kind of work that I want to be doing. Right now, we may not have those answers, and so, but I do want to just acknowledge that I hear you and thank you for constantly bringing this up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I also just want to flag for the council that, one of the constraints that we operate under is that we can't get together in a group and work with the administration on this proposal without it being an open meeting that's noticed, right? So we can't have, and the reality is this is something that we knew every councilor was going to be interested in. So it does mean that we're sort of like in this, like, let's put new things on the table, let's talk about it all together, dynamic in a public, like, setting, but we are.
The whole bucket, but I'm saying open would be leave 100 million open.
Yeah, no, I hear. I think it's just, I think we're all going to be accountable both for how every one of these dollars is spent and also for the question of how did we prioritize the overall, right? I'll say that from the committee's perspective, one of the questions we've gotten from people is like, well, where's the lion's share of the money going to go, et cetera? And so the fact that the lion's share of it is housing has been one of the things people have wanted to know about. So I think it's also kind of like, it's a question about the whole along with the specifics. Councilor Worrell, and then it'll be Councilor Mejia, and then Councilor Louis-Jean. Councilor Worrell? Oh, sorry, he had to step out for a moment, so I'll go to Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. So I really do appreciate my colleagues who have spoken before. And usually Councilor Baker and I are a difference of opinion, but I have to say, my man, I am right here with you.
That makes me feel good.
I'm sure it does. Because what we don't want to create is things being done to us without us. which is what I'm hearing my colleague, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson, also uplifting, that you all are coming here with a PowerPoint presentation, some dollars already earmarked to what your vision is, right? So, you know, it does feel like there was a lot of conversation that we weren't engaged in. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that we approved the budget. And we do have a role, and we have a responsibility in making sure that we hold the administration accountable to that transparency, right? Because people are gonna wanna know, show me the money at the end of the day. And so we have to be super responsible in how we do this. And I think yeah, it would have been nice to have a little piece of the pie that we can all eat, but we don't want to make this, you know, the Hunger Games either. And we don't want this to feel like we're trying to crack the Da Vinci Code and trying to figure out how you ended up here either, right? So there is a lot of work for us to learn how to do together, both the council and the administration, and we need to be able to lean into that work. And no matter how uncomfortable it could be, trust that at the end of the day, the bottom line is that we're here to serve 700,000 constituents. And whether it's the council or the administration, we're all accountable to those people, right? And so if we can start modeling that behavior in terms of really working across, you know, these norms, then we can probably get to a good place together and literally not leave anyone behind. So with that, you know, most of my questions, I'm always talking about the return on investment. I don't know if y'all have noticed that lately, because that is really important. So I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the dollars that we have spent so far. Because while I do agree that the dollars that we've earmarked have been good investments, I think it's important for us to make sure that we know what we're getting paid, you know, what we're paying for. So with that, can you just talk to us a little bit about the $1 million in Arpa funds that have gone to Community Violence Intervention Program? Sure. What's the status of that project? What community groups are we working with to ensure that it's successful? Can you also talk to us a little bit about, we spent roughly $3.5 million on COVID testing. So I'm just curious how many tests were administered, what is the breakdown of where people were tested and by neighborhood? And then I'm also curious about how generally we've been moving away from testing. And I know I'm just curious to know whether or not we're going to continue to invest in COVID testing, vaccine access, especially for communities that are disproportionately unvaccinated, just kind of like help us understand that. And then I'm also curious if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, I appreciate this investments in small business relief in the website, but I'm just curious if you had a breakdown of the recipients by neighborhoods in terms of the small businesses, and I'm hoping to also get a breakdown of the recipients by race. And if you have that information, it would be great to have. And then I'm also curious, how do we ensure that the money that we are going to be given to or have given to small businesses for paycheck protection actually gets into the hands of the employees? We have heard reports that several of those businesses that have applied for grants have had to start GoFundMe pages to support their workers. But I'm just curious, like, how are we managing that return on investment, making sure that those dollars that have been earmarked for things actually end up being used that way? And then I'm also, because I started my own nonprofit organization, I have such a soft spot in my heart for all things nonprofit, and they're doing God's work. And I don't know if I can say that in the chamber. Oh my God, I hope I don't get violated before already. But they're doing miraculous work, right? So I am incredibly encouraged to know that we're going to be leaning in and supporting a lot of our nonprofit partners in making sure that we are supporting our most vulnerable communities. But I also wanted to uplift our mutual aids. You know, there are a lot of organizations, many of which are volunteers. They don't even have, you know, they're working with fiscal sponsors, but they're trying to figure a lot of things out. So I'm just curious if you can just talk to us a little bit about the support that we're going to be providing mutual aid groups and the role that our bigger nonprofits can play in helping to build that infrastructure to support these groups. That's a lot. I don't know, I see you taking notes, girl, so I'm sure you got some data
I'm a big
for me,
note
so
taker.
bring it.
So I'll start first with the community violence intervention program that you talked about. So that's being overseen by the Office of Public Safety, Dr. Falk. There was 3 different kind of, I guess, sub-programs underneath it. One was $600,000 in grants to Boston nonprofits. I don't have the exact list in front of me right now, and so I don't want to misspeak, but I can share that with you. And that was really focused on kind of providing training, case management, mental health services, employment opportunities, et cetera. There was a second $200,000 that was to support SOAR Boston and the incredible team there on workforce development and training in partnership with OED, so kind of doing a cross-departmental collaboration. And then finally, there was a $200,000 for expanding case management services for proven risk men over the age of 25, led by the Boston Public Health Commission.
I have a quick question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I'm not sure if that gavel is, so.
Okay.
I'm just letting you know, my time is ticking, but
Okay.
I would like to know at some point, maybe this is something that I can get later, just kind of like how many people were served,
Yep.
what the impact of that, the outcome of that. Like, I really think it's important, and I probably am not going to get to all of my answers in this round, but I just think it's important for us to name that when I think about return on investment, I'd like for us to think about measuring our outcomes and how many people are going to benefit from this, what's going to be the return on that investment, how do we envision this, and then also thinking about a sustainability plan post when these funds go through, just something for us to think about. I think that some of my questions you can reply via email with just some data, but just if you could just respond to that point that I just made in terms of just kind of overall metrics and outcomes and you know, what that looks like.
Great point. And that's a really big part of the federal reporting as well, too. And that's coming down directly from the Biden administration. So that is something that we have incorporated across every program and was a part of the report on Friday. But we recognize that sometimes the metrics the federal government wants us to report on are not the metrics that we want to report on. So I think one of the things that, at least as the central A&F team, we often struggle with is, right, there are different metrics across programs, so we also need to get better about communicating across program, but I can share some of those metrics
That
from
would
the
be great.
community
And then the
violence
last thing I'll say
intervention.
before I hear the little behind the last call is that I think it's also really important for us to start thinking about that community input and working with nonprofit organizations and asking them what they need, how we can support them, what are the areas of interest from the folks that they serve that we want to lean into, so that it's not just the city and the council office, but that we're working in deep partnership with those who are living the realities or doing the work to inform our thinking as we continue, because we may need to reset. You know, you might have a vision and then 6 months from now recognize, oh man, we went down the wrong rabbit hole. We need to like do something totally different, and there needs to be some allowances for that type of back and forth and tweaking here and there based on the feedback that we get from folks that you're serving.
One of the programs that Chief Elliot Ortega can speak better to than I am, but I'm very excited about, I think we're all excited about, is the investment in $15 million for BIPOC-led cultural organizations. And that is obviously, nonprofit partners are a huge part of that. And one of the pieces that I know the chief is committed to is creating a council to help us learn from the process as we go, adjust as needed. And also what I think is really exciting is we are going to be able to offer multi-year grants, which is something that the city has not traditionally been able to do with our nonprofit partners, because we're operating on a one-year operating cycle, and so we do one-year grants. And so this is a really unique opportunity to do multi-year grants.
Thank you for that.
Great.
Thanks so much, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Louis-Jean?
Thanks, Chair Bach, and thanks to the administration for being here today. I want to echo that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to really use these resources to do the work of equity, and to really think about those who have been historically excluded and think about the corrective action that we have to take as a city to really right those wrongs and those policy harms. So I hope that when we start to dig into these numbers, that becomes, that target becomes clear. On page 13, could you explain a little bit more about the revenue replacement comparison and what that means in terms of how Boston compares to other cities? Just don't know. I think it was went over briefly, so I would like to get a bit more detail.
Sure. So I think what this table is displaying is Boston is using a smaller portion of this state and local federal fiscal recovery funds for revenue replacement, whereas the cities at the top of the chart, Philadelphia is, and I've been on calls where I've heard representatives from Philadelphia say, oh, we're hearing all these communities that are doing these transformative sort of corrective actions with their resources, and we're basically just keeping, the schools running, so that's basically it in a nutshell. That we
And why is that? Why is Boston
I think
able to
they
do
have
these?
more economically sensitive revenue sources. So
I mean, but why aren't we, Boston, why aren't we as sensitive as they are?
because we're primarily our property tax, which is fairly resilient. And also I want to toot our own horn a little bit in terms of like when we knew the fiscal, we started putting in actions in place to sort of correct for that. So when we refiled the FY21 budget, there was a reduction from when the original April budget was submitted. So that a lot of communities sort of ran in deficit or went. So we corrected our spending pattern. So, but I think it does gives us a huge opportunity to leverage the federal dollars to make these transformative sort of investments.
Yeah, and I think that's just the point that I was trying to make, and I've made this point before, is that we are an incredibly wealthy city, right? And we are a well-managed city, and sometimes there's a lot of overlap between those two things being true. This is a once-in-an-opportunity money, but I think the way that we, think about our resources here as a city and our investments, we can learn from these pilots and also lean into our fiscal strength as a city to make sure that these aren't just pilots, to make sure that these aren't just one-time investments, right? Corrective action isn't just going to be over after we spend $350 million, right? The work is ongoing because the policy harms are deep and they're generational. And so I'm just taking this as an opportunity to return to the fact that we are a wealthy city without this money. And the transformative work that we need to do, we have the financial and the fiscal capacity to do it. And I just hope that in addition to using this money, we think more critically about how we're using the city's purse to do that work of corrective action and not solely leaning on this one-time pot, right? We have property taxes, we have a strong economy that makes us able to do this transformative work more than just this great opportunity that we have in front of us. I'm going to echo a lot of what my fellow councilors said, including Councilor Fernandez Anderson, about making sure. So here we have this outline of money, and I'm looking forward to Councilor Bach holding additional hearings. I have no idea whether that $15 million grant, that $15 million allocation for BIPOC cultural organizations, like, have we thought about what those organizations are yet? Like, what is the, where is the thought process there? And I feel like there is some gray area in terms of knowing where the administration stands. Like, are these just, right now general ideas, or have we thought about what organizations? I think the council just wants to make sure that we are part of that conversation because we are in deep conversation and partnership with folks on the ground every day. And I just think that we need to make sure that that conversation really does happen hand in hand according to the open meeting laws. And then I guess lastly, the substantive thing that I'll say is when it comes to, I think Councilor Mejia was talking to this as well, when it comes to continued COVID recovery, that we continue to make sure, and I think that we need to be doing a lot more work to support our immigrant communities here, our undocumented communities with cash assistance programs. I think that we need to do a lot more work of making sure that we are entrusting communities to be stewards of city resources, and sometimes that means just where possible direct cash transfers. I want to just highlight that in immigrants communities, there's still this issue of trust when it comes to healthcare facilities, when it comes to vaccination. So hoping that that money goes towards continued work around COVID, but also thinking about how we work in partnership with building health infrastructure in immigrant communities that are hesitant and reticent to really deal with, hospitals or more of the structured healthcare framework that we have. And I know that's a difficult question, but there are nonprofits, for example, that are working on this, thinking in tandem about the work that we have to do to use this opportunity of COVID and the pandemic to build trust in immigrant communities in using and tapping into our healthcare system. So I don't know if you want to respond to any of the, Jim,
Yeah.
I talk about this all the time when it comes to our fiscal strength as a city and my disappointment in our inability to really lean into that and make sure that we are sharing the prosperity of this city and the wealth of this city with our residents in an equity-based lens, from an equity-based perspective.
I can talk more to maybe to the questions about some of, well, one, I think you talked about the nonprofit investments, the example I just talked about. I think as we think about the allocation process, typically when we're talking about a bucket of funds, we still have to, even once it's appropriated, we then have to follow a public process, whether that is 30B or a grant process, to meet our procurement laws, right? So I don't think there are specific nonprofits in mind that would receive those funds, because we want it to be open for people to put their ideas out and to apply for it. So
Yeah, I guess I just wanted it to be clear on the record that these pots of money right now are just pots of money where there hasn't been a developed, right? And we know that we want it to go to these organizations. Because I don't want to be pulled into something where it's like, oh, I want your thoughts, but the administration actually already has a plan for how.
No, I think that's the point of this further conversation. And yeah, we do have to have a public process, whether it's 30B or a grant process, before we ultimately give it out to the final recipient. So there's, I think, plenty of room for process and implementation design, and that's part of the reason we're working really closely with Mariangeli, Chief Solis Cervera's cabinet, so that we can make sure that equity is infused in the program design and implementation, because I think that the devil's in the details in how the RFPs are developed, how the grant applications are written. All of those things are so important to how the money actually ends up in the community. On the continued COVID recovery piece, I know BPHC will talk much more about it, but they've been partnering with folks like Equity Now and Beyond and some of our other kind of coalitions that have been doing health work kind of outside the traditional setting, and investing in those programs through a CARES-funded grant program, actually, through a different federal pot of money that we've been supporting over the past year. So I know they want to continue that work. And then finally, this will come up in a later hearing, but looking forward to sharing more about the Immigrant Economic Resilience Project, which is a CAST assistance program building on the work that we did over the previous year with the Massachusetts Immigrant Collaborative to support that specific community who hasn't had access to other federal benefits as well. So more details to come there, and then I will let Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add on the
I'm really glad that you're here to speak to all those specifics in the American Rescue Plan, but in terms of to address Councilor Louisiana's sort of concern about using existing resources, one of the components of the $380 million investment in housing is the capital component, and we had a hearing on leveraging bond funds. So there's $72 million of, and that's sort of a new bonding authority that we've leveraged, putting it directly into public housing. That is a movement in that direction.
I'll just uplift what Councilor Braden, the gavel. We slate for all these projects and then we don't get them done. So, and this is also a point that Councilor Brock has mentioned. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Lujan. I'm going to ask some quick questions, and then I do think we're going to go to the nonprofit panel, which has been waiting very patiently. I want to flag, so what we will do as a committee is we'll be sending over an information request to the administration that sort of formalizes all these questions folks have asked, and we'll send that to councilors so that if there's something that doesn't get into that but you want us to add it in, we can add it in, because I think it's always helpful to actually have those things on the deck when we have the next hearing. I think on a couple of things along those lines, I do think we need a better map. We need like an actual Boston-only census tract by census tract. There's no reason we shouldn't have that GIS layer. The council should not be in the position of sort of like squinting at an outline of the city of Boston and guessing like what tracks those are. That's clearly available data that we should have in a better format. I think that we do need to categorize these things by, like, I mean, what's actually physical infrastructure and what's personnel and what's like one-time grants. I think there's a kind of type of expenditure thing here, which is really important vis-a-vis some of the comments that other councilors have made about sustainability. I think that the city needs to be really clear about what are the things that we're building that are lasting because they're physical infrastructure, and then where are the places that we are throwing a ball up in the air to ourselves with a pilot and hoping that we will be in a position to catch it on the other end. And there are clearly things we should do that with, like we expect for, you know, our revenues to recover, and there are clearly like opportunities here, right? But I think we need to be really clear about how much of this money are we obligating in that way. It's the same question that we've asked BPS around, you know, how are you spending your ESSER funds and how much of them are likely to obligate the operating budget in the future. That's an important fiscal thing for the council to understand. I do think that we need, Councilor Braden's question, I want to amplify around kind of like expected expenditure timelines, both because obviously it's very important for the council that the city not miss those 2024 obligation, 2026 spend down dates, but also because I do think that understanding how it's going to impact Bostonians in the near and medium term is important, to Councilor Flaherty's point about seeing things. And on that front, I also think, Casey, it would be helpful to have an understanding of that for the already obligated ARPA funds, or really just appropriated, in many cases not sort of formally obligated, just because there are so many categories of things that we appropriated in June, but which still, when you go on the website, like we haven't actually obligated any of the money yet. And I think understanding like, oh, well, yeah, but a lot of that's all about to get spent in the next 6 months versus, yeah, no, we haven't really made a plan yet for that. I think it would be good for the council to understand what the sort of bleed rate on that's going to be. And then I would love to, and I think, you know, I've stressed this offline, but I want to stress here in this hearing that, like, this is, like, because this is this one-time funding, and it's something where, you know, Americans' government responded at the federal level to a moment of crisis with like this major source, like we need it to be expended efficiently and effectively. We can't have a situation where we're missing deadlines or, you know, projects are not getting delivered. Like, and this council's way of baking in that accountability comes at the front end, because our power over this money is an appropriation power. So I think we really need to understand like the delivery plans, right? Like the kind of, like, this gets back to timelines, but like, how are we going to make it so? Like, how are we going to make sure that we don't get bogged down in a year's longer procurement process or whatever than we expected? So I just want to stress that spending this money efficiently and having it really show things to people is key. And I mean, I already had opportunity to comment on this back at the budget breakfast, but for me, the key criteria, and obviously a number of them are included in your list, but it's really, yes, that it's responding to an urgent problem, but it's setting us up for some more systemic solution, even though these funds can't be a systemic solution themselves, and that there's actually something that endures after the money is spent. Whether that's something physical or that's a program that we have a hope of sustaining, right? But it can't just all kind of disappear after a few years. And then, you know, that we're really thinking about the public's role in all of this and how we're building up the kind of like public capacity of the city and the public goods in the city, and then this good jobs component, which we haven't talked as much about today, but I'm going to be harping on over and over, is kind of like, how do we make sure the way we're spending this money is creating really good jobs for Bostonians? And I know in childcare specifically, you guys have really targeted that, and it seems exciting, but it seems like we're going to spend a lot of money here, and we should be really intentional about that framework. My one question, so those are all kind of things on the radar that we'll be following up as a committee on, but I was wondering, since we have Mariangeli here, and because it's kind of a piece of the overarching, if you guys could talk a little bit more about that $5 million on making sure that the funds are spent like equitably and responsibly. Like, it's actually a fairly large number, so just understanding like what that's anticipated to pay for in a little bit more detail would be helpful.
Sorry, do you want me to respond to the earlier points too as well?
If you've got comments, sure, absolutely.
Okay.
But
no. I think we're happy to talk more about the expected expenditure timeline. And I think that's a great thing to know in advance. So as we prepare departments and cabinets for these coming hearings, that's something that we can make sure that they're ready to talk about and have information on that. So just appreciate that note as well. And then obviously we as an administration and finance cabinet also want to make sure we're spending all this money effectively, efficiently, and equitably as well. So you know, I think that as we typically think about, right, implementation plans that departments kind of put forward for investments, we're also using this as an opportunity to work with Equity and Inclusion Cabinet to make sure that we are more comprehensively building some of the outcomes and goals and metrics that you know, we all want to have better information on into some of those implementation plans going forward. So that's all I'll say on that. And then your question was on the $5 million for equitable administration and evaluation, which is obviously a significant amount of money in its own right, and about 0.9% of the overall ARPA funds that Boston is receiving. I think there's, you know, as we think about building kind of the muscle of the administration and bureaucracy of city government to effectively and equitably manage these funds, I think that we want to make sure that impact studies and program evaluations, stuff that we all want to do, doesn't get lost in the shuffle. And sometimes it's the thing that gets cut because, you know, if we're trying to put, it just oftentimes is, unfortunately. And we really want to make sure that we are dedicating money to learn from what we're doing, to track the demographic information that I know this council wants to see across every program, across race, gender, neighborhood, and that'll help us build that infrastructure to do that in a stronger way. And that will also be supported by some temporary staff positions. This is an unprecedented amount of federal funding kind of in recent history that is programmed to be programmed by city governments. And so we do need to flex our staffing capacity to be in compliance with the federal regulation, to do better analytics, to do better community engagement, and to support kind of the equitable implementation of these programs, right? If you think about, right, a department filling out an implementation plan, for example, and putting forth metrics and outcomes and outputs that they want to see, some departments are ready to go and ready to do that. Other departments need support and help to build that if they're a staff of 4, right? So we need to provide supports to departments to help them implement these programs to the best of our collective ability. So I think the staff positions are really there to build that, to flex and do that. And then finally, we put $250,000 in language access in last year's appropriation, and we want to build on that with $750,000 for a total of $1 million to ensure that, you know, we obviously, and there's been a large increase in the Office of Language Access in the FY23 budget, but we want to make sure that with these additional new programs that are going to be funded by ARPA, that there also is dedicated language access funding for that as well. And then finally, the boring but important thing is $250,000 for uniform guidance audit services to ensure that we are accounting for that cost that we will have to incur as a city for this ARPA fund specifically.
Great, thanks so much. Did either of you have anything to say, just because I want to wrap up my questions if you're, no? Great, okay. Yeah, so all of those things we'll be following up further on. I appreciate that breakdown. I felt like this was the right hearing to focus on that $5 million and understand it a little bit better. And thank you also for the presentation. I think what we're going to do now is I'm going to go to the nonprofit panel, and then I will take, there's a couple of people waiting patiently for public testimony. So I'm going to let our nonprofit folks speak and then hear from those couple of people. Right now I've got Marvin Vinay from Tech Goes Home and Dr. Julia Kohler from Equity Now and Beyond both signed up. And then we'll do counselor questions to the nonprofit group. I would appreciate it if you guys would like stay to listen to the nonprofit partners and on our testimony, because I know the testimony is likely to concern how we spend these funds, and obviously we want to make sure that the administration is hearing those things along with the council. But yeah,
We had talked about specific questions getting on record to make sure that they're
Yeah.
prepared in the, so like if I have a specific question, do I hold that for now, or what would you like me to do?
yeah, so I think what we're going to do, just because I'm mindful of the fact that we have our nonprofit folks who have been waiting for a couple of hours now. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to ask folks to submit those questions to us as a committee, and we're going to send them all as a giant info request over, which we'll look for people. Today is Tuesday, so we'll send out a formal thing to counselors to ask people to submit those by Friday so that we can get them over. But I feel like if we did put all of them on the record right now, we would hold the nonprofit leaders for another hour, is my gut. Councilor Mejia, were you?
Oh, no, Councilor Bach, we're in the chamber now, so I don't know if you could see our lights, but.
Yeah.
But you're wrapping up, but I wanted to just echo Councilor Baker's question. I thought I was gonna have a second round with this cohort here, but it doesn't seem to be the case, so it'd just be good to know rules of engagement so that we know how to manage our 7 minutes, because there was a question that I put on the record that did not get addressed in regards to how we're gonna support mutual aid groups and smaller nonprofits. So I appreciate that. I let you live and you didn't have to answer it here. I'll take it however I can get it, and then I'm gonna also put on the record a number of other questions that I still felt like I had for the administration, so that I'll just have to wait my turn patiently the next time around. Now I know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Mejia. Yeah, I think that we should go to our nonprofit partners, because I think they've been waiting for a long time. And like I said, this is one of a number of hearings, and I think that if we feel like we need specific questions to be answered by this panel again, we'll have them back at the next hearing. So, do you guys have anything else you wanted to say? No? Okay.
I'm assuming there's people going to come up here.
Yes,
so we
exactly.
can
So
sit
if
over
you guys
there.
can go over to the
Perfect.
side, and then we'll call up. We've got here today David Thompson. Oh, he's on Zoom. Jim Clock. So I'll read their formal, and then I'm going to let Councilor Braden introduce them more properly. But Jim Clock, the Chief Executive Officer for Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, is joining us in person, and Bob Giannino, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the United Way of Massachusetts Bay. They'll both be joining in person, and then on Zoom, we've got Elaine Ng, Chief Executive Officer of TSNE Mission Works, Amanda Hartigan, the Associate Director of Programs, Learning and Engagement from TBF, Michael Weeks, President and Chief Executive Officer from the Providers Council, and David Thompson, Vice President of Public Policy from the National Council of Nonprofits. So I think Jim and Bob can come up, and then Councilor Braden, while they come up, why don't you take the floor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Give me some sound here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I filed docket 0436 for a hearing on the recovery of Boston's non-governmental social sector, because I had heard from numerous nonprofit leaders in my district of challenges that they're facing in workforce shortages, decreased revenue, burnout, etc. All while the pandemic exacerbated existing stressors of increased operating costs, rising rents, inflation, and losing a talented workforce to the private sector. If I was hearing concerns from several leaders within my own district, it must be occurring citywide, and it's across the city. It also must be felt regionally and statewide. So my office connected with sector leaders to discuss the phenomenon and its impacts on Boston statewide and nationally, in order to inform consideration of transformative investments for the remaining federal relief funds. My office has organised a panel of non-profit sector leaders who will speak to the national perspective, the pandemic's impact on non-profits, examples of government non-profit partnerships with transformative Arpa investments, current challenges, including workforce shortages, and what's at stake for the city when our non-profit human service providers are unable to operate at capacity. I'm very pleased to welcome our panel members. Councillor Bach has already mentioned David Thompson, Vice President of Public Policy for the National Council of Nonprofits, the largest network of nonprofits in North America, and works to advance the vital role, capacity, and voice of charitable nonprofit organizations through state and national networks. Jim Clark is the CEO of Boston's nonprofit network, has more than 600 members from every region of the Commonwealth, and brings together all parts of nonprofit ecosystem, nonprofits, funders, community and business leaders, and elected officials to strengthen nonprofits and raise the sector's voice on critical issues. Bob Giano, I'm butchering these names, Giannano, President and CEO of United Way for Massachusetts in the Merrimack Valley, harnesses the power of people working together, including nonprofits, companies and government agencies, to build stronger communities and advance the public good. Elaine Neng is the CEO of Third Sector New England. Third Sector New England is a Boston-based national organization supporting the effectiveness of non-profit organizations, foundations, and community groups tackling the world's most complex issues. Third Sector New England provides capacity building for organizations through operational support, consulting services, professional development, and sector research. Michael Weeks is the President and CEO of the Providers Council, and the Providers Council, formerly known as the Massachusetts Council for Human Service Providers, is the largest human service trade organization for community-based human services agencies in Massachusetts and has over 220 members. And Amanda Hardigan is the Associate Director of Programs, Learning and Engagement at the Boston Foundation. And the Boston Foundation works closely with nonprofit organizations, philanthropists, civic and business leaders, and public officials, acting as a convener and civic leader to build a greater Boston that works for everyone. I want to thank you all for your participation this afternoon and hand it back to the chair. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And just so folks on the Zoom know, we can see you in the chamber. We have you up on our screen. So yes, we can see you waving as well. So I'll just go in the order that I've got here. I would just encourage folks, I know you've been asked to just make these statements brief. Obviously, this is a large panel of 6 people. And as soon as the panel is over, just before we do questions for your panel, I'm going to go to the 2 folks I mentioned who have been waiting for public testimony. So just want to stress to everybody, if you can keep those remarks succinct, that would be great. But we're grateful that you're here and that you've waited all this time. So we will start out first on my list with David Thompson, who I think is on the Zoom.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for making sure that the voices of charitable nonprofits are heard in this essential debate about how best to invest the city's American Rescue Plan Act funds to secure transformational change. We've heard the word transformation a lot today, and that's wonderful, because transformation and charitable nonprofits go hand in hand in our society, in our culture, in our daily lives. Rarely does one occur without the other. In my brief time, I'm going to try to hit 4 quick points, all of which are explored in more detail in the written statement submitted earlier that I hope you all have. First, while many sectors of the economy complain about difficulties finding staff, I submit that the nonprofit workforce shortage is a crisis affecting all of us. Here's one quick, if jarring, comparison. A restaurant's problem hiring workers may result in you waiting a few extra minutes in the drive-thru. Nonprofit staff shortages, and this is a real case, mean people seeking access to a domestic violence shelter must wait a month because there aren't the staff to help them. The differences can be life and death. So we ask that you help nonprofits in Boston secure the staff on which all Bostonians rely, and there are ways you can do this using ARPA funds. My second point is one Councilor Braden made a few weeks ago when she called for this hearing. She said it more succinctly than I did in my written statement, so let me just quote her. The Treasury Department recently, quote, clarified eligible uses for the City of Boston's remaining $350 million in relief funds to include the eligibility of charitable nonprofit organizations as both recipients of assistance as well as providers of assistance to others. That means you can hire charitable nonprofits to help solve the many problems that you're dealing with. Third, and I think really the reason that I'm on this panel, is that you have the benefit of the hindsight to call the good ideas from the bad ideas in investing the city's money. My organization has been tracking the ARPA spending decisions across the country. In my written statement, there I include examples from 16 other cities of how they partnered with nonprofits. I'm going to go off my plan of what I was going to say because Councilor Baker and Mejia and Chair Bach, you expressed concerns about sustainability or return on investment in these funds. It's a one-time fund. What can you do? Well, one thing you can do, there are lots of other things in my written statement. One thing you can do is go ahead and increase the reimbursement rate, make the cost of living adjustment, provide grants and contracting adjustments and fixes that have been around and in need of fixing for a long time. Use these funds up front to do the immediate restoration of where things should be, and then sit down with your nonprofit partners, government officials, nonprofit officials, council officials. Sit down together to identify duplication, waste, fraud, and abuse, things like that. My colleague on the Zoom, Michael Weeks, is perhaps the world's, at least the country's leading expert on how to do that in an effective way. So hopefully I've teased him to chime in there. The common denominator of the many solutions of successful programs that I cite in my written statement is the partnership between governments and nonprofits. And then finally, we commend Mayor Wu for many of her spending proposals, most notably a prioritization of investment in Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized populations, since so often they are left out when major transformative changes are being contemplated. We would also recommend that you at City Council not necessarily take that as verbatim, but add nonprofits as partners in delivering economic opportunity. And as I've just said, include improvements to reimbursement rates, cost of living adjustments, and so forth to help nonprofits get through the pandemic. You have charitable nonprofits in your communities, in your districts. Councilor Braden made reference to the ones who've been talking to her. I encourage you to reach out to them because they are facing challenges and they are creating solutions that you, the City Council can tap into and run with. So I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel.
Great, thank you so much, David. Up next is Jim Clock, Chief Executive Officer of Massachusetts Nonprofit Network.
Thanks, Councilor. Thanks, members of the council. I'm Jim Clock, the head of the Mass Nonprofit Network. We're the state's nonprofit association, 600 members statewide. And we talk to and we see what's happening in municipalities around Massachusetts. One of the big reasons we want to say thank you today is that you're doing this focus. It's a varied story across the state. Some municipalities are really asking the question, how can we help nonprofits? Nonprofits are eligible for these ARPA funds. Some are not, but we appreciate that Boston's doing that today. When people say to us, okay, what's the capsule story of the past couple of years? The pandemic hit, and the pandemic caused all kinds of hurricanes for nonprofits and the people they serve. They caused an operational hurricane. All of a sudden, you had to deliver services remotely. People you had been dealing with one-on-one, face-to-face, you couldn't do that, and you had to adapt quickly. It was an emotional hurricane for everybody affected by the pandemic and serving people affected by the pandemic. And it was also a financial hurricane. We are fortunate that many nonprofits were able to secure those federal PPP loans when the pandemic started. Not everybody got those PPP loans. And furthermore, even if you got a PPP loan, that was one-time funding. So what does that mean today? What that means today is that there are a lot of nonprofits who have current holes in their budgets. They have current funding problems. They have current funding gaps, which is one of the reasons why these ARPA funds are so valuable and they can make such a big difference for nonprofits. When people say to us, what are the things we should focus on right now today? Certainly on that list is the workforce retention crisis that David Thompson mentioned a minute ago. It is real. In some cases, it's exacerbated by state policy. When the state contracts with nonprofits, when the state contracts with human services organizations, they actually provide reimbursement rates which are pretty darn uncompetitive. So you get nonprofits who hire social workers, and they train them, and they give their heart and soul for 3 or 4 years, and then they leave for a job that pays $30,000 more because the nonprofit's hands are tied by government contracts. So as you're looking at funds to nonprofits, as you're contracting with nonprofits, if you can focus on those reimbursement rates, if you can provide indirect cost support, and if you can provide general operating funds, unrestricted funds in some cases, that will make a very big difference. The final recommendation I want to share really comes from a survey we did of nonprofits. We've been surveying our members throughout the pandemic. And in the most recent survey, after we asked them about their budgets and what they do and what their outlook is, we said, tell us about the people you serve. We said, here are a whole list of unmet needs. what do you think are the greatest unmet needs among the people you serve? And there were a lot of unmet needs that people frequently voted for. But the unmet need that they voted for the most, by a wide margin, was mental health. Mental health needs were identified by nonprofits from all over the state in this survey, of all kinds. They see it every day, they experience it. So we know mental health is a part of what you talked about earlier today with the city. We know you're all working on it. We know there are a lot of people who are dedicated to it. But I just wanted to share that from the standpoint of our members, they see those needs in the communities they work in every day, and we appreciate anything you can do to help meet those needs.
Great, thanks so much. Bob Giannino?
Good afternoon, Chair Bach, Chair Braden, distinguished members of the council. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm Bob Giannino from the United Way of Massachusetts Bay and Merrimack Valley. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for your efforts to support residents, youth, and families during the most challenging years of our lifetimes. We commend you for leading a transparent, community-driven process to solicit ideas on leveraging federal dollars to advance an equitable recovery in partnership with the city's robust network of community-based organizations. We must rise to this moment to make bold, transformative investments to build a more equitable safety net that uplifts and centers the needs of communities of color and low-income residents. History will judge us harshly, not if we are too bold and ambitious, but rather if we remain complacent and think too small. Annually, the United Way of Massachusetts Bay and Merrimack Valley provides over $5 million in funding to 85 organizations serving neighborhoods and residents of Boston. On behalf of those nonprofit partners, we urge you to prioritize the nonprofit sector as part of the city's equitable recovery. Along those lines, I'm going to touch briefly on 3 key points. The first, challenges facing the nonprofit sector. Second, the concerns for the nonprofit workforce. And then third, the opportunity that we have before us. First, the challenges facing nonprofits. Nonprofits have shown tremendous resilience and adaptability in light of the crisis, rapidly evolving to address and prioritize the most pressing needs facing residents and communities. However, as the city's nonprofits have faced their own challenges associated with the pandemic, the threads of the critical safety net that nonprofits provide to the city and its residents are beginning to fray. Increased real estate costs are putting real pressure on the bottom lines of community-based organizations. The demand to offer competitive salaries and benefits to employees is making it more difficult for organizations to hire and retain workers. The cost of technology, which could make agency operations and client service more effective and efficient, are often very expensive solutions that are out of reach. At the same time, the economic downturn has significantly diminished charitable contributions and other sources of revenue that are the lifeblood of many nonprofit operational budgets. More than 2 years into this pandemic, the long-standing economic impacts of COVID-19 are still being felt. We continue to hear it from our nonprofit partners about the importance of unrestricted operating support, their persistent challenges filling open positions, paying transportation costs, covering overhead, and recouping lost income from last year. Point number 2, the concerns we have for the human services sector workforce. Our nonprofit partners performed real emergency crisis response for the first 12 months of COVID outbreak. Caseworkers, mental health providers, and educators remain exhausted and running on fumes. Not only have they had to respond to the growing challenges facing their clients and families, but they're also juggling their own child care needs, reduced or unpredictable hours, lost income, and cumulative trauma of helping clients, families, and others navigate unimaginable hardships. We also know that the human services sector wages are historically underfunded. For example, the poverty rate for early educators in Massachusetts in 2019 was 15.3%, much higher than the 8.7% for Massachusetts workers in general. Last point, we have an opportunity with what is ahead of us. We have a key opportunity and obligation to help mobilize resources to build the capacity of nonprofits in order to successfully carry out their mission on behalf of the most vulnerable residents in our neighborhoods. Let's take a real close look at how we can provide and support the infrastructure that is necessary for nonprofits to carry out their mission. Let's think about how we can provide assistance modeled after how we approach support for small business owners to ensure that this sector has access to technology, can better navigate regulatory and human resource issues, and have the resources that they need to carry out the supports for their communities. Let's also ensure that community-based organizations like early education centers, after-school providers, housing agencies, and food pantries are no longer underfunded for their essential work. The needs continue to be vast and urgent, and bureaucratic hurdles should not stand in the way of residents accessing the support that they need. We urge you to stand with nonprofit organizations that are the lifeline for Boston's residents by allocating flexible stabilization funds for these needs. We have a unique window and an opportunity to act, and we urge you to invest deeply and sustainably in nonprofits that power the city's workforce and economy.
Great, thanks so much. Going next to Elaine, and just before I do, I just also want to note for council colleagues that after we hear from the panel and we hear the public testimony, like I said, I'll go to questions for the nonprofits, but also if you have those questions that you want to put on the record before the end of the hearing, if it's more efficient to say them, like, you're welcome to do that as well. All right, Elaine.
Thank you, Councilor, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I echo a lot of the sentiments of my esteemed colleagues and just want to reiterate and drive home some of the points that have already been shared. TSNE is a nonprofit capacity building organization in Boston that works with hundreds of nonprofits a year. We also own and operate the nonprofit center near South Station, which houses over 50 nonprofits, and we fiscally sponsor over 50 nonprofits across the region and the country. So through this unique lens and the work that we do, we've witnessed the myriad ways that COVID has really impacted our sector these past 2 years. Prior to the pandemic, nonprofits, and especially those with budgets of $1 million or less that serve communities of color, were already struggling with significant issues. And these issues include finding and retaining staff because of the endemic low pay and the high levels of burnout in our sector, the never-ending hamster wheel of fundraising that many nonprofit leaders are on every day to find money to support their core programs and their operation and overhead costs. And then dealing with the high rents that others have mentioned and finding affordable space and keeping that space for programming. Many nonprofits working under these stressful conditions are frontline organizations and are led by or serve people in communities of color. And when COVID hit, they immediately pivoted, with staff risking their own health to respond to the community needs and to the calls of action from our government to provide support. Now we have these historic once-in-a-generation funds to provide an opportunity to support the important and critical role that nonprofits play in our city's ecosystem and in all the work that they do to advance equity, especially in neighborhoods that are historically marginalized and disproportionately impacted by systemic and structural racism, as Chief Solicitor and others have mentioned in this hearing so far. And over the past 2 years, what we've heard again and again from leaders is not that they need funds to take on new work and to do more work, but they need funds for relief. They need relief for their staff. They need relief for themselves, and they need relief for their organizations and for their communities. And as my colleagues on this panel have pointed out, ARPA allows for direct nonprofit relief and also the opportunity for us to think creatively and boldly about how we use these funds. We don't need to be boxed into the old paradigms of the city contracting nonprofits to do more work in order to get funding. So in addition to some of the ideas that my colleagues have recommended, I'm encouraging you to think about providing funds for relief so organizations can have rent relief and can retain and improve their space. To provide funds focused on mental health and physical well-being so that nonprofit staff can get some relief. to provide funds to create wraparound capacity building support for smaller nonprofits so that they can decrease their administrative burden and find some economies of scale in partnership with other nonprofits, to provide funds for leadership retreats that focus on supporting the leaders' well-being and giving them a place to center and ground themselves. And most importantly, to provide unrestricted funds for core operations and overhead and administrative costs so that nonprofits can support all of the above activities and also pay their staff a real living wage to live in the city of Boston. I hope that you, the City Council, and Mayor Wu will be audacious and be bold and be willing to discard the old ways of thinking about contracting nonprofits to do more work on behalf of the city whenever funds become available, and to instead allocate funds for direct relief to support the sustainability of our city's nonprofits and the health of its workforce. A workforce that is worn down and exhausted from 2 years of direct crisis response and intervention, so that we can continue the work of supporting our city and its residents, because many of these nonprofit staff are also Boston residents. So thank you for your consideration and for your ongoing support of nonprofits in our city. And thank you for bearing through me with my raspy voice.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Amanda Hardigan?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Hardigan. I'm the Associate Director for Programs, Learning, and Engagement at the Boston Foundation. And we've worked in collaboration with so many of the panelists here, and I'm just so glad to see you and echo a lot of the sentiments that have been shared. Over the past 2 years of the pandemic, the Boston Foundation has dispersed over $10 million in COVID relief funds to nonprofits in the greater Boston area to provide direct support to people in communities with the greatest needs. So as a member of our COVID-19 response team here at TBF, I'm here to speak specifically as a grant maker to share some of the lessons that we've learned in the process of grant making, as I've been able to meet with over 100 of our nonprofit leaders during this time. I've listened to their stories of impact, how they've had to pivot and innovate in the face of overwhelming challenges. I've learned what has and hasn't worked in their partnerships with the philanthropic community. I've spoken to leaders whose staff are exhausted after over 2 years of running full steam, having COVID themselves, unemployment in their own families, without enough resources to take time off to recuperate, but whose dedication to the work has kept them going. Jim Clockey mentioned earlier that mental health arose to the top of the survey list as a current need in MNN's survey of nonprofits. In our hundreds of interviews, we heard that again and again, but not just about the constituents being served, but the nonprofit staff themselves and their mental health and their ability to carry on. Resilience is exhausting, and there are changes that we can make in the how of grant making to support our nonprofit community moving forward that will have a deep and lasting impact on the sector. So overwhelmingly, the feedback we've received from our nonprofit partners has been that trust-based grant making. So that's grant making where the funder acts as a true partner, understands that the nonprofit is an expert in their field, makes decisions quickly, listens to their communities, and ultimately knows what success looks like. That's what's needed, not just during a pandemic, but at all times. Trust-based grant making means unrestricted funding that allows for nonprofits to spend on internal operations, provide PTO and healthcare for their staff, make improvements to programming and operations that will ultimately allow for them to be more effective without burning out. We need to support our nonprofits by providing multiple years of funding, reducing their reporting requirements that are often redundant with other funders and take up unnecessary, valuable time. We need to provide the resources that will allow for nonprofits to pay their staff equitable salaries, that encourages staff to stay and grow and feel supported and valued. And we need to fund our nonprofits that are led by and supporting our communities of color, whose challenges have been exacerbated by COVID and whose work is invaluable to making Boston a more equitable city. Ultimately, our role as funders is to support our nonprofits by providing the resources needed for them to do their jobs most effectively, to learn from them and with them as new obstacles develop and plans inevitably change, to share ideas, listen to feedback, and think creatively about how to collaborate on society's most complex problems. Our job is not to make their jobs harder by creating requirements so rigid that meeting our needs takes away from the critical services they provide to the community. I think philanthropy has a long way to go to becoming truly equitable, but some of these measures can go a long way, and our humility and partnership is the only way to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And finally, Michael Weeks.
Thank you. Thank you, and I appreciate the fact that you're able to allow me to participate in this process here. I want to thank the city, and I also want to echo a lot of the comments that were made by my colleagues earlier. They were right on point and consistent with some of the things that I'd like to share with you about the council. The council was founded in 1975 as the state's largest association of community-based health and human service providers. We have a number of human service providers in Massachusetts. In fact, 20% of our membership in Massachusetts. I don't know, can you see my screen?
No, not right now. I think it's going to be a challenge for us to see it because we're seeing you on the screen where we would see it.
Okay.
We can make sure if you would submit, is what you're trying to show us in your written testimony that you submitted or not?
Yes, yes. So you've got it right in front of you.
So counselors all
That's
have
fine.
that in front of them, yes.
Okay, okay. Apologize for that. So as you can see, a number of the organizations that are part of the council are people that you well know. They provide human services from working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, those with mental health, substance use disorders, children and families and women that need protection as well, hunger and homelessness, the whole full range of human services throughout the state. And at least 20% of our members' organizations are based in Boston. And I should tell you, in terms of jobs, in terms of the economic impact of our sector, according to the UMass Donahue Institute, I've done a number of reports. We have 180,000 jobs here in Massachusetts, so it's a significant sector, but it's also a sector that is poorly paid. And I should also tell you that another factoid that might be of interest to you, it certainly is one that concerns us, is 8 out of the 10 of the employees are women, and there's a growing number of people of color that are part of that too. So when we talk about gender equity, we've got to look at our sector and realize that we've got a problem in terms of our workforce. Now, I should tell you also that one of the major things that I hear from all of our members, whether in Boston or other parts of the state, major concern they have is the workforce. We just do not have enough people to be able to provide the services. Now, I know that you've heard that from other sectors, and while I certainly appreciate the fact that waiting online longer for an ice cream cone because there's not enough people there to help is a problem, and perhaps not getting room service when I want it at one of the hotels as soon is a problem. But quite frankly, the consequences are quite different for the people in the human services field. For example, on our substance use disorder, I was talking to a member who provides residential services to that population, and he explained to me that generally he would have a program that is full, 100% of capacity. Right now, he's at 50% of capacity because he only has staff available to cover and help 50% of the people that need that. That means that 1 out of 2 people that need services from his program are denied that service. So when we talk about this workforce crisis and we talk about it in the context of having vacancies and not having staff, we got to realize that what we're talking about are service cuts. And we're talking about people in need who are not being able to get the service that they need. And if they're not getting it immediately, they're either on a waiting list or in other ways unable to get that when they need it. And we are the safety net. So we really have to think about what are we doing here when our safety net programs aren't able to respond as quickly as they should when people need to do that. Now, the primary thing that we know is that the problem is compensation. Our state reimbursement rates that are being proposed by the state right now are $16.79 an hour for median wages until July 2024. And I want to stress the word median because we're competing with folks like Target, which is starting people at $24 an hour, or Bank of America at $20 an hour, or even Hobby Lobby at $18.50 an hour as starting salaries. Realizing that our MIT living wage calculator in Boston sets the living wage at $22.77 an hour for someone with no children. And of course, if you have one child, that jumps up to $45.49 an hour. we simply cannot compete with the rates that we're at right now. And it's amazing that our human services workforce, which is an essential workforce, is doing the jobs that they're doing, and we thank them for that. The other factor is Massachusetts is losing population. The working age population is graying, and you know, we're getting older. I certainly am one of those as well. And because of that, we have less people that are going to be in the workforce. In fact, it was predicted that between the period of 2015 to 2025, we will be losing 40,000 people out of the workforce. And while that's a problem, when you're not paying the salaries that will really become competitive, then you've got a very difficult decision to make. So in the time that I have here, I just want to talk about a few things that I think would be meaningful solutions for the city to consider in supporting our workforce. And we realize that the state pays a big amount of money in supporting the workforce that's needed. It should, 1 out of 10 residents have some degree of involvement with the human services sector, so it makes sense. But we'd like the city to think about ways in which they can creatively use Arpa funding. One thing that they might want to consider is for human services organizations is reimbursing organizations up to $5,000 as a recruitment or retention bonus that would go to the organization if they're able to have someone from Boston be able to work in this sector. Many other private organizations are providing bonuses. This is not out of order. This is a one-time fund that will help get people who really need the help live in the 4th most expensive city in America, Boston. The second thing is set up a grant program for organizations to purchase IT equipment and access support services. We think is important as we have to become even better at what we're able to do with a decreased workforce. And the other piece that I think is important for our organizations is if you can set up a capital fund so they can get money to do things that they aren't able to get from the state. And that's for construction, purchase, repairs for programs, modifications, helping to serve Boston residents with state-of-the-art facilities. And for the workers, it would be important if they can get some rental or mortgage assistance for those who are living in Boston. Second thing, perhaps institute a college loan forgiveness program and you may want to do something that we think would be helpful is to offer a 50% discount on maybe the MBTA passes for human services workers who live in Boston. And the last thing is something you've heard earlier is also to help them develop effective wellness programs for staff. The mental health issues are significant with a workforce that's working more hours than they should. It's not unusual to run somebody that's working 60, 70, 80 hours a week in order to make it in Massachusetts. That's way too much and is stressful on a lot of people there. So we think there are some real ways in which ARPA fundings can be used at one-time payments that are not ongoing, but can really boost up where we are right now. I mean, we often hear from people who say, well, we're concerned about putting money in a system that we can't sustain 3, 4, 5 years from now. I get that, I understand that, but quite frankly, our sector may not be here 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. And the people that are on the waiting list who might have a substance use disorder and need help, they don't have 3 to 4 or 5 years. So this is an immediate problem that we need to take care of today with today's dollars. And the last thing, I've left you with some reports and some research so that you can see where the data that I'm getting is coming from as you consider some of the solutions I've put forth and some of the things that others have said as well. So I thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Michael, so much, and to all the panelists for those substantive comments. I'm going to go now to take these 2 patient members of public testimony we've been waiting on, and then we're going to, like I said, do a round of questions for our nonprofit panel, and also, like I mentioned, councilors are welcome to put on the record further questions for the administration if you have them already and you want to do them now instead of sending them to us later. But first I'm going to go to Marvin Vinay from Tech Goes Home, and then on deck will be Dr. Julia Kohler from Equity Now and Beyond, who's on the virtual hearing. And Marvin, if you can come to the mic right here. Yes. We will get that on for you. Yeah, Tech Goes Home, well known to the council. We're all big fans. And I want to thank Marvin also for submitting the written testimony, which I think all the councilors have a copy of. But
sure.
Mr. Vinay, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. Marvin Vinay, Chief Advocacy Officer for Tech Goes Home. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the City of Boston's plans for utilizing federal funding from the American Rescue Plan Act and the critical importance of leveraging those funds to advance digital equity in Boston. Mayor Wu has laid out an ambitious plan to use the federal stimulus resources, including funding for affordable housing, inclusive economic development, climate resilience, art and culture, pandemic response, behavioral and mental health, and more. But digital equity is deeply tied to each of these priorities. Providing more Bostonians with the tools and support to participate in the digital world will allow more people to search for housing and identify available resources, learn and work remotely, or grow their businesses online. It will also expand access to vaccines, critical telehealth and virtual care, and help combat the effects of social isolation, especially among our seniors. We strongly encourage the city to consider using a small percentage of its ARPA funding to make an initial $2 million investment in expanding digital equity in the city of Boston to Tech Goes Home. Tech Goes Home is a Boston-based nonprofit that for more than 20 years has worked to expand digital access and opportunity. We have partnered with more than 500 CBOs and trained more than 1,000 digital inclusion instructors to provide devices, reliable internet service, and digital skills training to individuals and families in Boston and beyond. Over the past 5 years, 21,000 people have graduated from our programs, but the need for digital tools and training, it remains significant. According to newly released data, more than 51,000 households in Boston don't have a computer. 40,000 households don't have broadband, and we know that many more struggle to use those tools, particularly without culturally responsive training. Without support, these barriers can prevent people from accessing critical resources and opportunities and deepen racial, academic, economic inequity in communities across the city. Leveraging available ARPA funding will enable TGH to build on our community-centered approach and strengthen the ecosystem of systemic solutions to the problems at the root of digital inequity. We will create up to 100 new partnerships with CBOs in the city. We will bring digital literacy training and free Chromebooks to up to 4,500 new households, connecting as many as 70,000 Bostonians to the digital resources and transition thousands of learners to multi-year sustainable internet services through the Affordable Connectivity Program. Collectively, we can bring thousands of Bostonians online today and into the future and help the city reach its ambitious goals for greater equity and opportunity across the board. We thank you for calling this hearing. We remain eager to be partners with this city, and we look forward to any questions or concerns you might have about our proposal. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Marvin, and thank you for this detailed proposal for a $2 million allocation. Next up, as I mentioned, is Dr. Julia Kohler from Equity Now and Beyond. Dr. Kohler, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair Bach. Thank you, counselors. Thank you, administration. My name is Dr. Julia Kohler. I'm a pediatric infectious disease specialist. I'm also a molecular biology bench scientist. I'm associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. I've worked closely with grassroots immigrant organizations, among them the organizations that have joined forces in Equity Now and Beyond since the beginning of the pandemic. 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago actually now, I was really shocked to realize how deeply immigrant communities were being neglected with respect to protection from COVID. Which is still the case in our state. The 2 to 3-fold higher COVID death rates among Latino and Black Massachusetts residents are worse than even the already stark national divide in infection and death rates. And these shocking disparities in COVID sickness and death have persisted from the beginning of the pandemic through this latest winter surge. In that context, I've been seeing firsthand that the extent to which immigrant communities are protected and were protected is directly related to the work of these grassroots organizations. These organizations have brought testing, vaccines, food support, eviction protection, protection from deportation, and help with other social determinants of health to their communities. And I've been working with La Colaborativa in Chelsea, with the Brazilian Women's Group and other organizations in Equity Now and Beyond in that regard. We have to actually recognize that the pandemic is not over. Right now, wastewater virus levels are actually fluctuating around where they were in early February. Right now, it's the Omicron variant BA.2, and now we're hearing that variants BA.4 and BA.5 are infecting people in South Africa who had immunity to previous Omicron variants, suggesting we may not be protected. And at the latest this fall, we're going to have another COVID wave, and we need to think about that and prepare for that right now. And in fact, even right now, with the current BA.2 variant, we have another stark inequity staring us in the face. There are effective pills to treat a COVID infection and to prevent hospitalization and death in people at risk that work if taken within 5 days of symptom onset. That means that to be protective, we have to get tested, talk to a doctor who can check our drug interactions, get the prescription, and get the prescription filled within 5 days of symptom onset. We know that residents of our city who have good health insurance, who are health literate, who have their doctors and are in close touch with their doctors can access these pills. Those pills are called Paxlovid. And we know that other residents of our city, many other residents, especially undocumented residents who have kept the city running for the past 2 years, don't know about these pills. They don't have a quick access to a test oftentimes, let alone to a prescription for these pills. This is an issue that's happening right now, and we need the immigrant grassroots organizations to have the resources so they can connect their communities with the treatments right now, like today and tomorrow, and with testing and with vaccines and the other resources that families need to survive and to regain their footing and to thrive. And one more point that I would like to highlight. So immigrant grassroots organizations, in addition to providing their communities access to COVID protection with vaccines, actually their efforts to vaccinate are ongoing, and they need to be ongoing. And I will also say that more effective vaccines, perhaps nasal sprays, are in the pipeline and will be coming out, and we will need grassroots organizations to make them accessible to their communities. But right now, another thing that is happening is people are still standing in line for food boxes, like in East Boston. And I want to highlight Councillor Louis Jeune's point about cash support. That is urgently needed. 2 years into the pandemic, why are people standing in line for food boxes? These residents of our city deserve dignity. They deserve recognition and gratitude for what they have done, and they deserve care. Their organizations need funds and support. Also, we should recognize that oftentimes those closest to their communities have the least resources for grant writing. And I am truly hopeful that with this city administration and this city council, these organizations and their communities will be seen and will be supported more than over the past 2 years. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kohler. And thank you for sticking with us, to both you and Tech Goes Home throughout this hearing. All right, I'm going to go down to counselors. And again, you can direct questions to the panel. You can put questions on the record for the administration for our next hearing on these dockets. We'll start with Councilor Braden, the sponsor, and then it'll go to Councilor Baker, Murphy, Mejia, and Louis Jen. Yeah, okay. Councilor Braden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to echo my deep gratitude to the nonprofit sector. This has been a really incredibly challenging time, and many of your organizations, not only are they in the front line all the time, but when COVID hit, you pivoted very quickly to providing very, very much needed essential support for our most vulnerable residents. In terms of staff retention is a huge issue. Rising rents and security in your places where you have your organizations is another. And you know, how I almost feel like we're trying to empty the ocean with a tin cup. You know, where's the most important, most critical spot to focus our attention in, given that we have limited resources? 350 or whatever $1 million seems like a huge amount of money, but it's not really that much given the scale of the challenges that we're facing. What would give us the most bang for our buck?
Two things that come to mind for me, Councillor. One is on this question of the rates at which the city reimburses nonprofits for services. I realize these are one-time funds, but the policies you set in the disbursement of these funds can live on, and they can also, frankly, send a signal and help with the broader cause of raising these nonprofit salaries. So I would vote for part of it going there. And then the other part, you know, the idea of kind of one-time capital spends, equipment spends, space spends, in a targeted way, I think that can be helpful. I agree with you, there's not enough for everybody.
Yeah, I know. And the other question I have, you know, given our recent news about, I think it's a 700 million surplus at the state level, are we talking to our state colleagues about how to, you know, hang on a minute, we've got some money we can spend, that's money we can spend.
Yes.
How are we asking that, our fellows up at the state, what they can do?
It's a great point to share. And A, we and a lot of others are doing that. B, the state has another $2+ billion of ARPA funds that they haven't allocated yet. The question, everybody's wondering, when are they going to do it? And some of us think they will do some of it in the next 3 months in this legislative session. They don't have to do it all for another year or two, but the first $4+ billion, that moved out the door, but there's still 2+ more. The governor proposed last week some ways to use it. The House will take their shot, the Senate will take their shot. And frankly, decisions Boston makes about its ARPA funds will help us reinforce the case to the state, that when you, the state, set these reimbursement rates, when you, the state, think about how we're going to compensate direct care workers, here's a municipality that's being a leader in this. Here's a municipality that's showing us how it can be done. And in that case, frankly, that'll have a ripple effect, a direct substantive ripple effect all across Massachusetts. But then, you know, David Thompson will tell you these are issues around the country. So if we can do our part here, it's going to help the cause all over the country.
Yeah, if I can add in there, it clearly is something that the state really has to take also a lead on in providing support. They are the biggest funder of state services and state supports. This is clearly something that we've at the council have advanced with the administration and talked about how to use ARPA funding funding, but also ARPA funding as a bridge to fix a purchase of service system that's not working correctly and to really get them up. So the ARPA funding alone is not going to take care of this. It's all short term, but it can bridge for 2 or 3 years until it gets to a place where it needs to get correctly. And we've been advocating for that and continue to do that with bills and legislation, because quite frankly, if we do not support this sector, we will not have a safety net. And the situation is already at a bad case right now where people are just not able to get services that they absolutely need.
Yeah,
I follow up with Jim Clockey and Michael Weeks. The nonprofit workforce nationwide for nonprofits, the #1 challenge is the nonprofit workforce shortage. The survey we did late last fall, 80% of nonprofits reported salary competition, the things that Michael Weeks was talking about. Also, 25% or so said that inability to access childcare. So helping nonprofits pay salaries, better salaries, and helping with the childcare are two things that you can do, whether it's bridge, whether it's long-term, that can most effectively support, remove the very dire warnings that we're giving you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm gonna, I'm supposed to be going now to Councilor Baker, who's just, we're gonna jump to Councilor Murphy.
I often say how the mental health crisis is one of the pandemics within the pandemic. Also, staffing and workforce is another crisis that we've been struggling with. It's not going away anytime soon. And I heard all of the panelists touch on both of these topics, and I really appreciate that. I know a lot of the work we've been doing on the council has been around that need. You know, COVID-19 shattered so many small businesses in our neighborhoods. We see the empty storefronts, and it's a reminder of the economic devastation that this pandemic has caused. But we also have seen the nonprofits from the beginning stepping up and providing services to keep our city moving forward when we shut down. You were there, right? We saw you there. Even if it was me seeing you through Zoom, you were there in person, and you were always helping the people that you were already helping before the pandemic. Also appreciate how you all pivoted and shifted so many times. Once when you thought you were getting it right, the world changed, the needs changed, and you seemed to just keep showing up, smile on your face when the people came to you and needed all the things that they needed. I quickly learned in my first, few weeks here in government that a city cannot run without strong partnerships with nonprofits, that you keep this city running, and that we can't think of you as extra, that you're part of, you know, you're part of those wheels that keep us on the road. So also, you know, the necessary supports that you were giving, you continue, and people, it's been mentioned that people continue to need food, they continue to need help to keep their lights on. You kept people alive, like physically alive, so I appreciate that and understand also the surge in mental health needs that we saw. I filed an order, we talk about it a lot, that we knew that seniors were isolated, we knew that so many of our members in the communities were suffering through mental health and recovery needs, and the COVID-19 just made it worse. And so we need to be ready to support those needs. And so many of the nonprofit organizations here and that we know work across the city are already doing that work. Before I move off to, I know with like Digital Ready, I know from coming from the classroom and coming here also, a lot of times we saw seniors needed to wake up at 2 a.m. and figure out how to log on to a computer to get in a line for a vaccine that was just not working. Students needed to figure out how to get Wi-Fi in their mom's car because she was working late, right? So we saw that it just didn't work. So that's also something that is affecting the mental health of our community. So definitely appreciate your work and your ask, definitely. I also understand the need for more staff. You know, it's across everyone needs that support for but also for your current staff. So I do want to speak out here that we need to make sure that we do more to help increase the salaries and training if needed, to more supports around mental health for the communities you're serving. Many people are telling me that they're coming and we don't have the right training to support if it's trauma or mental health support. But I also want to speak to the need that your staff needs wellness and mental health support. You yourselves probably do. We spoke of this at one of the school budget hearings, that we're needing and will advocate for more mental health supports for our students. But we have to remember that our teachers are suffering also. So if we're not supporting and protecting all of the people doing this work, that they won't be there, right? So to remember that. So I really don't have any questions. It's just that I'm here to advocate and support the work you do and make sure that you're in a position to continue, because we know it's only going to get bigger, right? We're going to need more as we climb out of this pandemic, which isn't over. It's shifting, it's pivoting itself, it's changing, but it's going to get harder, I think, as people come out of their houses and we see the needs that they have. Like, we know so many students, like with attendance and others, like fell through the cracks. We don't even know where they are or who they are yet. So the needs aren't even identified yet. And I know that all of these nonprofits will be there ready. So we need to support you. So thank you for being here. And I hope that the administration is listening to make sure that we put this one-time funding in these places. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Murphy. Next up, Councilor Baker, then it'll be Councilor Mejia. Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the work that you do, all the nonprofits. We all work with them. Just a couple statements here. Thank you for this hearing here. I am still somewhat concerned that we're fully baked on this, in the fact that I'm hoping we're going to be able to get some requests in here, and I know you have some requests also, but to just some specifics in moving forward, what I'm gonna like to see, you know, we have $60 million for affordable home ownership and development financial assistance. So we're gonna drill down on that. What does that look like? What does a 57 for strategic acquisition look like? You know, 20 million for permanent supportive housing with specialized services for substance use disorder. Where is that? Where is it? Councilor Flaherty had talked about shovel ready. Is there anything shovel ready? We're going to actually point to projects that we're going to spend $5, $10, $15 million on that will build actual programs, or is this just 20 million and we're going to overlord it and give it out $1 million at a time, same like we do with the housing trust? And then also my last question that I'm very, very concerned about is 16 million to maintain low threshold shelter sites in response to mass and cash humanitarian crisis. So does that mean that the roundhouse, that when we started the conversation, it was a 6 month fix? Before we even got to talking about the MOU, it was a 1-year lease, then a 2-year lease, and at the end of the MOU, and I've mentioned it multiple times, there's an option to buy down there. So is this administration looking to buy the roundhouse and turn it over to, it's a specific question here that I want an answer to, because we've been sold a bill of goods if that's what they do plan on doing with it, because the talk for the last 5, 6, 7 years has been, how do we decentralize? This really doubles down on the bet that the area will be exactly the way it is for years to come if we allow something like the roundhouse to continue. Basically, they came in there under the cover of Doc, and if it were a setup program in a hospital or something like that, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But it's basically letting people go into hotel rooms and operate whatever way they want to operate. We still have prostitution down there. There's still rampant drug use, and I have a feeling that a lot of it might be coming out of there. So I would like that specifically answered. Is this 16 million? What do you mean in response to the low threshold? Are we looking to buy all those assets that we were told were a 6-month fix? So thank you for sticking with me, Madam Chair. And like I said, I'm just going to be looking for real specifics, especially when it comes to the housing. Because if we're putting this type of money into housing, we can do some special things, but not if we cut it all up, $500,000, $1 million at a chance I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but we need more money going into actual shovel-ready projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Baker. Yes, we'll put all of those questions into the information request, and I'll just like emphasize, I agree with the idea that, like, especially on the housing front, what the outcomes have to be tangible. People have to be able to be like, there's the housing that we built. Like, this is, you know, this is who we housed.
Just to stick with me for a second, $57 million for strategic acquisition to combat displacement and deeply affordable developments on city-owned land. That sounds great to me. But tell me actually what you actually mean by it. Where are the parcels? What are the buildings gonna be looking like? Are we offering those supports to say, this is what we want built as a city, here's the city asset, here's the city money? So I'm gonna be looking for specifics on that sort of stuff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Baker. Councilor Mejia.
Leaders and those who have given public testimony, just a few things. First is that, yes, I'm all in for digital equity. I saw firsthand the difference that the internet can make, and actually being able to educate people on how to access Zoom, and especially in multiple languages. And I know that, you know, investments around digital equity, we fought on the council around creating a study so that we can look at municipal broadband and other ways that we can ensure that everyone, and I mean all, folks across the city of Boston have access to equity in terms of internet access and just digital education. So I think it's going to both boost our economic and also our educational system. I think that it's a win-win when we're talking about digital equity. So I just want to go on the record in big support of that. And then I just have a few questions for the folks who spoke in regards to the nonprofit sector. And maybe there might be a question here in this, but I wanted just to uplift, right, the importance of really understanding the fact that our workforce is underpaid and oftentimes over-delivering, right? So we're expecting our nonprofit sector to do more with a lot less. And having worked in the nonprofit sector nearly my entire life, I know that those who are doing the heaviest lift usually are the least paid. And so I think that there's definitely an opportunity for us in terms of investments when we're thinking about increasing salaries, when we're thinking about making those workforce development investments, that we do that. And part of that should also be professional development, and how are we ensuring that you go from being a case manager to being a program director. And when we're talking about the nonprofit sector, I also just want to name for the record that, you know, a lot of our nonprofit leaders aren't people of color. And so if we're talking about equity and we're talking about a long-term vision, look into the equity people, you know, and who are ever going to spend these dollars, that workforce development piece also needs to make sure that we're leading towards making sure that communities of color are also in positions of power, making those decisions. So I think that should be part of the conversation. And then I also would just like to add, you know, we talked a lot about mental health and wellness, and I'm glad that Councilor Murphy and both Councilor Baker talked about recovery and addiction. I think that oftentimes we talk about mental health and wellness, we lose sight that COVID, in the time of COVID, a lot of our issues around addiction, drinking, substance use disorder, those things have increased, and also those things have increased among younger generations, right? So I think that it's really important as the nonprofit sector continues its work and its scope of service that we really think about recovery and support services, not just for our constituents, but also for your staff. Like, that is key to really start thinking about how do you build infrastructure to ensure that your staff is well protected and supported. The other piece that I just want to uplift is that, you know, we've always said this, and we knew that the next biggest pandemic after COVID was going to be mental health. And we've been saying that even before it was a thing to say, right? We knew that it was already even before COVID came. And I think we've asked everyone to go back to work, and we haven't taken a moment to pause. And everyone is just to hurry up and go. And that's just the culture. And I think that as part of this recovery, as the nonprofit sector continues to support, we need to really think about how do we take a step back and really think about our own social and emotional and mental well-being. So I think that that is something that you all as nonprofit leaders, when these dollars become available to you, is making sure you come ready to talk about a plan about what mental health and wellness looks like for your workforce. Because that's a big part of the recovery. And then one last thing that I'll say, and maybe any of y'all can speak to this, is that suicide is definitely something that is, for me, one of the biggest concerns that I think we need to continue to uplift, especially folks who are experiencing housing insecurity, job insecurity. There are a lot of folks who don't know how to cope. And I think that as part of the recovery, that conversation needs to be across the nonprofit sector, within the city's workforce development. Like, that is key. And how do we help support people? And I know that the mental health and wellness is there, but I think it would be helpful to be more explicit around some of the very specific initiatives that you all are going to lead. And I think Julia, if she's still with us, talked about, you know, I think that we need to really get out of the framework of charity. That's not empowering. Right. Like, we're not here to do for people what people can already do for themselves. And as we start really thinking about what recovery looks like, it's important for the nonprofit sector and even city government to recognize that we are resilient, and that we're not as hopeless or as helpless as people have led us to believe, right? And that when we start thinking about how we're going to recover, we do so leading with the assets of our people, not with their deficits, because that's what I see in nonprofit sector. We always talk about all the things that our people do not have. That's how we get those dollars. And I really hope that we get to the point where we're leading with our assets. And how do we build on those assets? Because that's what's gonna shift the conversation. And I think that that is really important as we start thinking about recovery and reimagining. It should also be reimagining how the nonprofit sector sees the resiliency in the people who have experienced the struggle. And I think I just wanna lend that as something for us to think about in terms of our language and how we show up and asking for support. So I said a lot. There might not be no questions there. Y'all may not have anything to say, but I had the mic. And I wanna seize the mic because I worked really hard to get into this chamber to use it. And I have 2 years to be here to do so. So that's just the way that I roll, period. End of story. And I think that those who are listening in need to recognize that from the technical assistance, like Third Sector New England and other organizations that are working with the nonprofit sector, is that we also really need to think about how we're supporting these smaller organizations to really help support the nonprofit sector, so it doesn't feel like the nonprofit complex industry, which is how a lot of people see the nonprofit sector, that it oftentimes is just another industry, and we need to really shift that thinking. And that's it. Anyone wants to remark? I don't know if the gavel's gonna go up or Councilor Breeden giving me the eye. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm done. I'm good.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. That did elapse the time, but I'll definitely take responses to Councilor Mejia if people have anything.
Well, I'll just go in and say there was a lot to unpack there. So I don't even know where we can start with that. And I'd love to have a more in-depth conversation because there is much there. But was that chime mean?
No, go ahead. It just went off.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just got started. I was saying, wow. So clearly you talked about leadership of color. That is clearly a big issue in many sectors in Boston, but particularly in ours. And we just know that we're not going to be able to have people are not coming to Boston to take over our jobs. So we got to grow our own, quite frankly. And we've got some initiatives in place working with Suffolk University to try to build and grow our own leadership and to get them involved and engaged. Because it ought to look more like the city and look like folks are there. And we also need to know, and I hate keep coming back to the workforce and the dollars, but I've been in meetings with all of the CEOs of our organizations, and I asked them, how many of you are recommending that your children go into this field raise your hand. How many? No one raises their hand because they all know it's hard work, it's stressful work, there are some behavioral health issues that come out, and they're not getting compensated and paid. They cannot pay back their college loan. So it's complicated, it's a lot going on, but I think we can work with the city on some of the ideas we've talked about and others can talk about. We can start chipping away from this. There's a lot that can be done and a lot that should be done. So I'll pause and let others weigh in too with that, but I thank you for your comments.
I'll just say a couple of quick things here. Thank you, Councilor, for what you shared. I think the city can do two specific things to support some of the thoughts that you shared. One is invest in nonprofit infrastructure organizations like TSNE, like the Institute for Nonprofit Practice, those that are doing their work to build a stronger, more vibrant, more resilient nonprofit sector that are focusing on organizations that are led by people of color, people with lived experience. That's number one. I think those organizations are often overlooked, mostly because we want our dollars to go to direct serving organizations primarily, but those direct serving organizations need those infrastructure organizations strong and resilient as well. That's the first. And then the second is something that we've been taking to heart in the shift of United Way's strategy and work is I would prioritize investing in nonprofit organizations that spend time engaging with the communities that they serve to understand what their needs are, what they want, listening to the communities that are being served. To your comment around charity and around the sector as an organization that does to community, that is the sort of the historic knock on a wide array of nonprofit organizations. And I think this is an opportunity, if we're talking about an equitable recovery, for the city to prioritize in its decision-making process nonprofit organizations that have people with lived experience leading their organizations, governing their organizations on boards, that have real connection and listening processes and engagement processes with the communities that they're serving. Because there's a lot of organizations out there that have historically received resources and funds, and the reason they continue to get resources and funds is because they've historically received resources and funds. And in fact, we can use this opportunity to change the way we've always done business.
Great, thank you so much. I just
And
want
can I add just one more point that
Sure.
as you in Boston innovate it, we can take it to the rest of the country and show them the right way to do it. So thank you for working at it.
Great, thanks so much. I just have a couple of quick comments. One is just to say that I think, the idea of good jobs came up earlier in the hearing, and I think that's so important. And I think the idea of are there ways that the city, when it allocates some of these funds in ways that we're looking for nonprofit partnership in, is writing those grants and contracts and stuff in a way that really says, hey, people need to be earning a living wage in Boston. I think that I know that the administration's got a proposal that's sort of along those lines in the childcare front, but I think it's a really good point about the way we engage the whole sector. And then hopefully that even though we obviously are a relatively small entity compared to some others, and certainly compared to the state in terms of the number of nonprofits that we can contract with and grant to, that maybe we can be a model that you guys can then say, well, in Boston, they've acknowledged that this is what you really need and all of that. I do think that probably means on the city side, and I'd be interested to hear from your guys' perspective, on the one hand, I know that from the nonprofit perspective, getting money in lump sums and getting to sort of figure it out yourself and not have too many strings attached is always valuable. On the flip side, I think that if the city were trying to guarantee good jobs, it would mean a certain prescriptiveness of not wanting that money to go to, for instance, padding salaries at the top of the organization, but really making sure that we were establishing a stronger floor for some of the folks doing the direct service work and such. And so kind of interested in what people think about that, because I think that's something that we might want to explore.
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, 1 second. And Elaine, before you go, wait, Tech goes home.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give you guys are leaving, and so I just wanted to give you a shout out and say I'm very sympathetic to the proposal you guys put forward today. So we'll be discussing it at greater length later.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Sorry, Elaine. So I'll go
No
to Elaine.
problem.
I'll go to Elaine and then we'll go back here in the person. Go ahead.
So as you were speaking, I was just thinking, one thing that the city council can do is to, have some conversations or create kind of a kitchen cabinet group of nonprofits that, do this kind of work on the ground and get their perspective and ideas about how to create some guardrails, for the funds that you want to provide. So I think, some of the things you threw out there, like, not padding salaries at the top, or maybe creating ratios for nonprofits to meet between the highest salary and the lowest salary, like, creative ideas like that can come from nonprofit leaders organically, or even staff of organizations. So engage them as thought partners in creating, the guardrails for more open-ended initiatives.
Great. Thanks so much. Jim?
Councilor, one of the numbers we pulled before this hearing was the number of nonprofit jobs there are in the city of Boston, and it's over 200,000. So that's 550,000 statewide. So Boston is a big nonprofit hub, and anything you do here in Boston, I think will have a big effect and send a big signal.
Great. No, yes, and we're always happy to lead the way in the state. We try. All right. I think that was my main question in response to what you guys said, but I really appreciated all the thought everybody brought to this panel, and appreciate Councilor Braden bringing this sector in at the start of this conversation so that we can really be thinking in all the substantive ways that the council wants to engage with what we're doing with the money, right? Also thinking about who are we partnering with and how do we make sure that that those are strong partnerships and that they also model the future, right? Because that's like, with this one-time money, if we can change the way that subsequent monies get spent, that was one of the things I heard you guys saying, is like, if we could set a new standard, and I think we've got to feel that way also on procurement, like on everything, right? It's got to be like we model with the federal money what we want to do with subsequent monies. Yeah. So I think what I'm going to do now is go to my council colleagues who are still here just for any closing statement, and then we'll wrap up this hearing. If you are watching and you never got a chance to give public testimony and you did want to, it's not too late. You can, if you're here in the chamber, sign up on the piece of paper over in the corner, and we will take you right at the end here. Or if you're watching at home, you should email right away, ccc.covid19@boston.gov. And again, as I said at the start, if you watch this later, plan after hours, and you want to send us written testimony, again, the address is ccc.covid19@boston.gov. So I'll go now to council colleagues, starting with Councilor Braden, the sponsor of one of these dockets.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panelists this afternoon. I'm really so grateful to you all for being here and bringing your perspective to the conversation. I'm just reflecting on all the document that we got from the city about, the mayor's ideas about where we might spend some of this money and how we might allocate it, and just really struck by the intersectionality of all these issues. There's a huge amount of money being dedicated to affordable housing. Our non-profit sector, the workers are earning, they need those affordable housing. In transit, they need those services to get to work. All of it, the behavioural health and wellness, early education and care, recovery, ongoing pandemic response. Every single piece of this document is touched by the non-profit sector in Boston. So, and I'm really, 200,000 jobs in Boston that are non-profit sector. It is huge. So I really thank you for your participation this afternoon. You've given us a lot to think about, and hopefully in partnership with the administration, we will actually be able to make some suggestions that will help move the ball down the field. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Braden. Councilor Murphy?
Thank you for hearing, and also for the administration who was here earlier, and the nonprofits. I always say, we don't know what you need, I can't assume, so it was great to listen and learn about the needs you have and how we can advocate moving forward. And also thinking about your last comment when you said the money's always gone to certain nonprofits, which they're probably doing good work, I'm not knocking them, but being able to recognize others, either new ones or ones who have been out there and really never knowing how to break into this funding. I know I mentioned like the Phoenix earlier and others that are doing work around the needs we know right now. We need to spend a majority of this one-time funding on. Our needs are in mental health and recovery right now, so we really need to focus and put our money there where we value it. And I know Councilor Braden, when you mentioned that, also then connects to housing, right? People who are struggling with mental health and recovery also need housing. So all of these other buckets are definitely necessary and needed and part of the, the big, the pie. So these pieces are important. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Councilor Murphy. Councilor Mejia?
Yes, so I just wanted to acknowledge Casey. Yes, so I just want to say thank you that you stayed in here with us as long as you did. Like, that says a lot to us and to the people who are tuning in, and your commitment to this conversation and the work. So I just want to give you a shout out for that. Normally the administration helping as soon as they get by, but so it's good to that you stayed. So thank you for staying. It means a lot. And I'll just say really quick, I started off my career in the nonprofit sector. The only time I didn't work at the nonprofit sector was when I worked at MTV for 10 years. And even while I was working at MTV, all of the work that I did was cause-related and pro-social. So I worked with nonprofit organizations to tell their stories, to uplift the issues that so many young people across the country were facing. So I say all of this is that the nonprofit sector are essential workers, right? When the pandemic hit, you were the ones on the front lines as well as our other essential workers, but you guys stood up and were providing support services to so many of our families. So you are essential to our recovery, and we need to ensure that we continue to engage you in how we can best support you, because people trust you. They are working alongside you. So what better way for us to serve our constituents than to work in deep collaboration with those who are doing the work. So I just want to say yes, in anything that we can do to help support you all in this process in terms of recovery. I don't know if y'all can see us, but I'm looking at you guys. That's weird. Can they see us?
Yes, they can see you.
Oh, y'all can see us. Okay. Good, because Councilor Murphy asked me and I didn't know what to say to her, so they can see us.
They can see you.
So yes, and to you guys, thank you for joining us and bringing so much of your wisdom. I do look forward to the technical assistance piece. I think that is really going to be key in helping our smaller nonprofits grow. And so look forward to partnering with you all to make that happen. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being here in person, on Zoom, and for those who tuned in. And special big shout out to Casey. Let everybody know Casey's stayed in the building. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. And yes, I will second the thanks to Casey. And I think it's important, especially because it is the beginning of this public process for the council around these funds. And as we've stressed today, we have a proposal from the administration. It's got a lot of facets. It addresses a lot of things that Bostonians are anxious to see action on, but there are also a lot of great ideas in the council, many of them overlapping, and also, as we've really been hearing from our nonprofit sector today, we have to think about how we're spending money, not just the substance of what we're spending money on, and what partnerships we're building with that, and how both in the style of what we do, as well as in the sort of physical infrastructure we may create, we build something that can last, right, and can endure past this moment. Because it really is, when we talk about the Green New Deal, when we talk about, hey, this is like our transformative chance, that's what transformation means, is that things stay different on the other end, right? That's the difference between transformation and a flash in the pan. And so it's going to be super important to this committee that really we figure out how to use these funds in a way that is transformative, and I'm looking forward to the work ahead on that front. So you'll be hearing lots more from this committee. We'll be having many more hearings. We'll be surfacing both more specifics in the different departments in the administration's proposal, but also councilor proposals, and proposals like the one that was brought to us by Tech Goes Home today. And really looking forward to all that conversation. I don't believe there's any further public testimony that's signed up. So with that, this hearing of the Boston City Council's Committee on Boston's COVID Recovery is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Chair.